evening's Cabinet meeting. Please note, we'll start with the filming at meetings notice. So please note that this meeting is being filmed or recorded by the Council for live and subsequent broadcast via our internet site. It can also be recorded by anyone attending the meeting using any communication method. And although we ask members of the public recording, filming or reporting on the meeting not to include the public seating areas, members of the public attending the meeting should be aware that we cannot guarantee they will not be filmed or recorded by others attending the meeting. Members of the public participating in the meeting, for example, making deputations, asking questions or oral protests, should be aware that you are likely to be filmed, recorded or reported on. By entering the meeting room and using the public seating area, you're consenting to being filmed and to the possible use of those images and sound recordings. As chair of the meeting, I have the discretion to terminate or suspend filming or recording if the continuation of the filming, recording or reporting would disrupt or prejudice the proceedings, infringe the rights of any individual or may lead to a breach of a legal obligation by the Council. For the members of the public who haven't attended a Cabinet meeting before, we'll start with routine business items before considering the deputations that have been put forward and then proceeding to the HDV scrutiny review and Cabinet response. We'll then consider the open part of the report on the Haringey Development Vehicle, financial close and establishment, which is item 10, taking questions on the open part of the report. And then, as with usual procedure, followed for Cabinet to continue we will then, as the usual procedure, follow for Cabinet to consider the remaining reports on the agenda before going into private session at item 15 and 16 to consider the exempt information on the Haringey Development Vehicle financial close and establishment in order to consider the recommendations of the report and take decisions. The decisions from the meeting will be published on the Council website as usual. Apologies for absence. I know that we have apologies from Councillor Vanier, who has a family bereavement, Councillor Amet, whose mother is ill, and Councillor Ejiofor. Do we have any items of urgent business?
Chair, we have no items of urgent business.
Okay, does anyone need to make a declaration of interest? I don't see any. Okay, have we received any representations in relation to item 5?
No, Chair, we've got no representations in relation to the exempt items on the agenda.
Thank you. Okay, so the minutes of the meeting held on the 20th of June, can Cabinet confirm those as a correct record of the meeting? Thank you very much. Deputations, petitions and questions. We've received 3 deputations this evening, all in relation to item 10 on the agenda on the Haringey Development Vehicle. These are from Paul Burnham from Haringey Defend Council Housing, Reverend Paul Nicholson and Dhirendra Howder, Chair of the Council of Asian People and representing the Haringey Community Hub. Each deputation spokesperson will have 3 minutes to address the Cabinet. I'll then invite Cabinet colleagues to put forward any questions to the deputation party, and following this I will ask the relevant Cabinet member, the Cabinet Member for Housing and Regeneration in relation to Mr Burnham's and Reverend Nicholson's deputations, and Councillor Goldberg in relation to the deputation from Mr Howder. At the completion of the deputations, I'll ask the deputation participants to move to the gallery where there will be a reserved seating area for you. We'll then move on to consideration of item 9, the scrutiny review of the Haringey Development Vehicle, part 2, and then consider the Cabinet response to the recommendations. And then after this, we'll move on to item 10 to consider the Haringey Development Vehicle and financial close and establishment. So I understand in relation to the first deputation, is Sue Hughes here? Yes. Good evening, Sue. If you'd like to come forward and take a seat. Okay. As will have been explained to you, once I turn my microphone off, yours will be able to be turned on. You have 3 minutes to make your deputation. There'll be any questions from the Cabinet, and then I'll ask Councillor Strickland to respond. And just to be clear, I said Mr Burnham, you're speaking on behalf of Paul Burnham and Haringey Defend Council Housing, who made the deputation. Yes, that's fine. Okay, when I turn my mic off, you can turn yours on, and you've got 3 minutes.
My name is Sue Hughes, and as has been said, this is a joint deputation between Haringey Defend Council Housing and Stop HDV Campaign. The latest plans for the proposed HDV, nearly 1,500 pages of legal and financial documents, which you saw fit to release just 1 week ago, include some really disturbing information. I'm going to outline just a few from the documentation, all of which can be referenced. Lend-Lease have made it very clear that they have their own housing policy direction, which is to move away from affordable tenures completely and instead to take homes to the market to buy and rent for a range of income levels. In other words, Lend-Lease will want to charge whatever the market will bear, and the result would be the social cleansing of those who cannot afford to pay or do not have the savings required for a deposit. Though you have promised tenants, including housing association tenants, the right to return at all estate renewal sites, the documentation makes it clear that this does not have to happen at Northumberland Park. Furthermore, the documentation includes mention of the London Borough of Haringey having to pay the HDV for any tenants that do return. The truth is that tenants would be very strongly discouraged from returning, as has happened recently in Love Lane. I am deeply shocked by something that somebody has just told me, that in the scrutiny committee they asked for assurances that there will be no poor doors. Your response in the documentation that separate building codes for different tenures may be necessary for no good reasons as far as I can see. Are you really seriously suggesting that we segregate some of our tenants, many of whom may be black and from minority ethnic groups? All the promises that you have given for the HDV depend on development viability, and yet the council estate demolition schemes all have large viability gaps. Time and again we have seen this means promises to tenants and residents can be broken, but developer profit is sacrosanct. It's no exaggeration to say that we've lived for 3 weeks that have changed the housing world. There's a real possibility that we may soon have a Labour government committed to building hundreds and thousands of new council homes, and meanwhile a weakened Tory government pressurised Grenfell to rethink social housing. Now is really the time for you all to pause and reconsider, because tonight you're going to be asked to vote to partner with a company who partnered with Southwark Council on a regeneration scheme that bulldozed 1,200 social homes and built just 82 replacements in the Haygate. You're going to be asked to partner with a company that make it clear that they cannot make much money out of council tenants and have little use for the poor.
Your comments to a close.
Sorry. Indeed, the classification for the for Lend-Lease is that council tenements are described as municipal challenges. Most importantly, I have to say, you will be partnering with a company that flouted Australian building regulations and used combustible cladding materials in their properties. We need to know from you tonight, what has Cabinet and Council done to find out from the Australian authorities the explanation that Lend-Lease gave for fitting illegal cladding? And has Lend-Lease mentioned any of these things to you?
Thank you very much for that. So I'll first turn to any questions from Cabinet members. If I could start myself, Sue, you mentioned the release of 1,500 pages of legal and financial documents. And I guess where we are as a council is in a position where we're wanting to act in full transparency, and therefore releasing all of those documents, to my mind, felt like a really important act. And I just wanted to get your sense of that. Obviously, there are very strict protocols governing the release of documents, the timing for documents to be released. But I just wanted to check, you're not suggesting that we produced a redacted form of the pack in order not to have too much information, are you?
Not a redacted form, but an enormous amount of documentation for people to read within 1 week. It's practically impossible, and I think it's really cynical.
Okay, any other question? I had one further question, if that's okay. Oh, sorry, I'll take Councillor Arthur, you had your hand up, and then I'll...
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your deputation. One thing that I wanted to get your thoughts on was the political context, because you rightly noted the political instability that there is at the moment, the fact that Labour made a lot of progress at the last election and that the Tories seem quite unstable. I guess the challenge for us and for me is the risk of not acting if, for any reason, a Labour government wasn't to come into place very soon. And the fact that many of our residents who are on waiting lists, who are in desperate need of housing and affordable housing, need us to act now as opposed to wait. So it would just be good to get your reflections on that. And also the fact that this proposal is that it would enable us to put things into the HDV in phases, so that if there is a change in the political context, that we wouldn't have to pursue certain phases in order to benefit from potentially additional funding that might be there.
Paul is going to answer.
Yeah, this proposal from Lend-Lease is highly political. It couldn't be more political than Lend-Lease having their own housing policy, which is to get rid of affordable housing 10 years and have straightforward market housing. And repeat that twice in the document. It's absolutely clear what's being proposed, and this is the kind of stuff we've had from the Tory government, we've had from the Condems, we've had for a number of years. We have to fight back against this. People are getting angry about this. I sometimes suspect that you as a cabinet think this is inevitable, you can't do anything about it, but there is resistance and opposition to it. This is a time of hope. Corbyn, the vote for the Labour Party in the election was a huge vote of hope. The resistance of people in North Kensington is a vote of hope. David Lammy is supporting those people. He's doing the right thing. And Catherine West, we need to think again about going in the direction which you're going. Because if you look at those documents, it's quite clear this means getting rid of council housing completely. That's what Lend-Lease want. They'll be in the driving seat because they 100% manage that company. They 100% develop the policies. They put it all down in black and white before the possibility comes of signing up to it. We're asking you not to sign.
Councillor Goldberg.
Thank you, Leader. I've got three questions I'm quite interested in hearing about from the deputation team. Firstly, I think, like you, I feel extremely disappointed by the general election results, and that we don't have a Labour government to be able to tackle the levels of inequality that we're seeing and the anger that's rising. But I was also concerned that 500,000 homes didn't feel like enough, particularly when not all those were social, when there's no specific commitment in the manifesto to raising or eliminating the borrowing cap within the Labour Party manifesto, and therefore no mandate to do so, and no indication, even verbally, that they would do so. So I'm curious to understand specifically the core demand I keep on hearing from yourselves and from fellow campaigners is, can't you just pause for a bit? And the question I have never had an answer to is, how long should we wait for a Labour government before we decide, actually, we're not going to get one in any time soon, and we need to get on and build houses? Secondly, do you believe less house? Last time you came, Paul, this is my second question. Last time you came and you explicitly said, I would prefer nothing as an option. I would prefer no more homes in Haringey. Doing nothing isn't a better option. That is what you said in the cabinet meeting. So that's what I heard. It's good to hear if you change your mind. But that's very clearly what you said when we put it to you. I'm very keen to understand. How do we... No, I just want to ask a question. How do we solve the problem of the 8,000 people who are waiting for homes in this borough if we don't go ahead with this programme?
Councillor Goldberg, have you got your final question? Just two. OK, when you're ready, please, Sue.
One of the major problems, I think, with this particular arrangement that you are trying to put together is that there is nothing, absolutely nothing, for any tenants that are on waiting lists. So I am slightly confused by your particular argument in that case. I actually do believe that the Tories are very weak, and we will fight for a Labour government to release some of those caps, and I think that that's a great possibility. What you're going to be doing in terms of signing up with Lend-Lease is giving everything that we have away. And make no mistake about it, this company is going to roll you over like nobody's business. You're sitting here as though, you have got some kind of 50-50 chance with this. Looking at this documentation, Lend-Lease are going to make mincemeat of you, and we will end up 5 to 8 years later with virtually no council homes. And a promise here that there may be poor doors for minority ethnic groups. What kind of council is likely to vote this in?
Yeah, you lot. Please don't. So please don't. Think again.
But have you got one more question, Councillor Goldberg?
I just don't feel my question specifically is how long should we wait for a Labour government to... You asked for a pause. That wasn't...
I am Jacob Secker. I am the Secretary of the Broadwater Farm Residents Association, which is an elected position. I'm elected to the committee of the Broadwater Farm Residents Association before I hear any rubbish from anybody about this. I am furious about these proposals. If people are asking how are we going to house people, let me tell you how you're not going to house the people at Broadwater Farm, and I'll tell you now. You are not going to house them by knocking down our homes and then telling a majority ethnic minority population that they can only come back if they live behind poor doors, which is what your proposals mean. No poor doors, no! Over my dead body! You will not bring in poor doors for my tenants. Never, never, never. Get that through your heads. We fought segregation. Before I was born, people fought segregation in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. You go back, go on the internet and see what happened in Birmingham, Alabama when people like you tried to bring in segregation. Don't do this to my tenants. No, no, no. Listen.
Okay, my final question, and then I'm going to ask Councillor Strickland to respond. Sue, in your presentation, you said that, I made a note of it, that you had read that the 40% affordable housing conditions would not apply to the Northumberland Park estate, and you also said that the right of return wouldn't apply to tenants of the Northumberland Park estate. Now, that's, in my view, entirely incorrect, but I wanted to understand where you'd read that and why you had that concern.
Pass over the floor for that.
Yeah, I think I'm sure Sue didn't say that.
If I misunderstood, I'm sorry. There's obviously background
can
noise.
I please?
So, very happy for you to respond. As I say, there's a lot of background noise, so happy for you to address that if I got it incorrect. But I was just checking that that's what I believed you'd said. Yeah,
the council has made offers and concessions that people can return to their homes, and importantly extending that to housing association tenants, something we've argued about for a long time. But in the documents it says that Lend-Lease in the form of the HDV is not going to facilitate that in phase 1 sites, the significant phase 1 site being Northumberland Park. The document then says that the council may facilitate that in some other way, and that way of facilitating the return of people would involve making extra subsidy to Lend-Lease. I think that is disgraceful as a proposal, because it means that the company you want to go into partnership with is not going to carry out the policy of this council. They say they're not going to do it. That is in itself is a reason for not going into partnership with them, in our view.
Okay, I'm going to ask Councillor Strickland to pick up that point in his response. I see that he's been noting furiously the points that you made, so I'll ask him to respond to each of the points. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sue, for your deputation. If I can run through some of the points that you raised. The first one, then, in terms of the documents. Now, other councils have set up joint ventures, have taken decisions to set joint ventures, and there's some going on at the moment where I know for a fact that other councils in London have not released anything like this amount of information. I gave a clear public pledge at a previous meeting that we would release everything we could possibly release. That's what we've done, and we've taken the decision to put out as much as possible. Now, I'm sorry that equals a lot of information, but this is part of our commitment to being open and transparent and publishing stuff. So the second point then, in terms of, so you made a number of points about affordable housing and the commitment, suggesting there was no commitment to replacing affordable housing. What's made clear in this document we've discussed at previous meetings is that the development vehicle, the partnership, is bound on housing by the Council's housing strategy, which was unanimously agreed by full Council. In terms of the jobs and business space it will create, it is bound by the Council's growth and economic development strategy. In terms of how it rehouses people, it is bound by the Council's rehousing strategy. So it is not the case at all. It is completely wrong to suggest that the HGV will sort of do its own thing. It is quite heavily constrained by existing council policy, as other people are in the borough. But of course it's important to say, Leader, that actually there's a much bigger constraint, a much bigger control over the development vehicle, because it's not just the case that officers will be saying, have you met clause 5 of this policy? There will be a cabinet member and senior officers on the board itself. So no major decision can be made by the company unless we agree, and of course therefore we can veto anything that we do not like. The third point then was around the right to return. The right to return, and suggesting that the right to return was not clear. It is very clear in these documents, Leader. It was made very clear in the previous Cabinet meeting. But also we've got a borough-wide strategy on rehousing, and some people were concerned that that policy was not clear enough. And that's why at the moment we are consulting, as Paul mentioned, I think, we are consulting on a revised version of the rehousing policy, which makes even clearer that there is a guaranteed right to return. So I think that is very clear. Now, in terms of and it's important to say that only tenants can waive that right, because tenant choice at the heart of this. So as we know from other estate regeneration schemes, some tenants.
Sorry, can I ask people in the public gallery? We've got a number of community representatives talking at this evening's meeting. The Cabinet member is now responding. This is a meeting that's being held in public, and we want your views to be heard, but so too do we want to hear the responses to the views that are being aired. I just asked, there's a lot of noise outside, if people could please show some respect and just keep their voices down.
Hello. Hello, my name is...
Sorry, I'm asking, you'll have to turn your microphone off. It's a public meeting. It's not a public meeting, it's a meeting held in public, and we have quite a clear protocol in terms of the way that the meeting proceeds. Councillor Strickland.
Thank you very much. So what's really important to say is that the tenant choice is absolutely central to this. So what we know from the Love Lane estate, which is separate to this but has obviously been happening earlier, is that many tenants want to stay on their existing estate, they want to return to their existing estate, and the policy guarantees that. But other tenants say, I was placed on this estate by the Housing Office 10 years ago, I'd rather move back to Wood Green, Stroud Green, the place I lived originally with my family. So tenant choice is absolutely vital. The other thing to say on this is, in terms of this question of the involvement of Lend-Lease and the Council, what the policy makes clear that tenants can exercise that choice. Now, it's quite right that the Council takes a lead as the Housing Authority in speaking to those tenants and working out, do you want a right to return, do you want to move elsewhere into Council stock? So I think saying that Lend-Lease doesn't work on that approach, I think, is not particularly controversial. It is the job of the Housing Authority to lead on the rehousing side of things, working with our housing staff and with registered providers. The fourth question then was around the comment that was picked up about pour doors and different entrances to blocks. Now, I think we need to be very clear about this. The document does not say that there will be lots of separate entrances everywhere. The document does, I think Sue said there was no reason given in the document. The document does give a clear reason, and it says that for service charge reasons and other estate management reasons, sometimes blocks are built with a different entrance for the affordable bits versus the private rented bits versus the private ownership bit. Now,
OK, I'm going to have to ask you to settle down. Councillor Strickland, if you could continue and wrap up your point.
Thank you. Yeah. So if I can finish. So what I was about to say is, clearly, as a council, and I've talked about this myself in this room at Planning Committee, that is not something that we want as a council. That is something that we ask developers not to do. But the report is honest, that if you look across London, councils Councils, I'm trying to answer your question. If you could stop screaming at me. Councils, housing associations and others recognise that in some blocks, this can lead to much higher service charges for residents. That's why the report is very honest that this is a discussion that will be had with residents, but our clear aim as a council is, of course, for the reasons you give, to avoid that. On viability, this is very, very different to other schemes in London, because what cannot happen with the development vehicle is that Lend-Lease turns up and says, here planning committee is a viability assessment, get on with it. Because, as I said, nothing can be decided without the council board members being involved. No viability assessment, no decision about what to offer on affordable housing can be made without those council board members agreeing. Finally, Leader, in terms of the pause, we have to recognise that. If we said tonight, well, we're going to stop and, as Councillor Goldberg said, wait for a Labour government which may or may not appear, that means stopping moves to build 6,400 new homes, stopping moves to bring 1,000 new jobs, stopping moves to bring a new library, new school, new parks and community facilities. But also what is the point that's made very clearly in the papers is that this model allows for significant flexibility. There is a big difference between a partnership being set up to deliver regeneration and what that regeneration actually involves. The substance of what's being delivered is in consultation with residents, is being separately discussed, will be subject to separate further consultation, and if there is a Labour government in the future, which everybody around this table would absolutely love to see, and there is more money for social housing, which is desperately needed, this gives us plenty of flexibility to make things happen. Leader, the final question was on fire regulations and discussion with Lend-Lease. The Assistant Director and the Chief Executive have been discussing this, and Dan can come in.
Yes, so just to clarify on the point on specifically Lend-Lease's record in Australia. So we have discussed this at length with more than one occasion with Lend-Lease. They are not aware, and they have not had raised with them by any authority, of any Lend-Lease building in Australia that is unsafe to occupy. And so we haven't... We've not...
I'm going to have to ask you to stop shouting because we can't hear the answer. So can we just, please... We want to hold this meeting with members of the public here, but we can only do that if you show respect for people that are speaking. Dan, can you finish?
Yeah.
Thank you for your deputation. But the deputy... what I would ask you to do then, Sue, is your deputation is complete. He's given a fairly full response, I think. What I would ask you to do... That's fine, but the deputation... Sorry, that's the deputation... So... well, he has given a response. He can...
We asked whether the Council has asked the Australian authorities about the relationship with Lend-Lease.
OK, Sue, I will put that to the Assistant Director. I then have to say that's the end of the deputation because I've got Reverend Nicholson with his deputation next. Dan, can you respond to that specific question?
We haven't done that.
Thank you. Thank you for your time this evening. If I can ask you to take your seats, and I think you'll be shown up to the public gallery if you wish to stay for the rest of the meeting. Reverend Nicholson, as they move away, if I could ask you to come forward, please. So, Reverend Nicholson, I'm sorry, we're moving on to the next deputation. Reverend Nicholson, I think you were here when I explained it to the last speaker. As soon as I turn my microphone off, you can turn yours on. You have 3 minutes to present your deputation. And when it's complete, I'll ask Cabinet members to ask any questions they may have of you. And then, again, I'll ask Councillor Strickland to respond. So, whenever you're ready.
I am representing an entirely Afro-Caribbean number of people who signed the application, who live in Northumberland Park. First, I want to summarise the work on the equality of Professors Wilkinson and Pickett, because I don't think you have grasped what you're doing to people. Some commentators suggest that poverty is not the result of low incomes, but of things like addiction, mental illness, poor education and imprisonment. But the truth is that these are primarily the effects of the stresses of inequality, and particularly of being on the wrong end of it. You cannot read the feelings of shame, of failure, of being disrespected, and seeing as inferior experienced by people in poverty without understanding why it leads, and as the data shows, it's on evidence, it's based on evidence that I'm talking about, to more depression, more mental illness, more addiction and more imprisonment. And those additional difficulties will often lead to job loss, homelessness and lower self-efficacy. Struggling on an income so inadequate that it denies you what is seen as a respectable way of life feels as if it almost broadcasts your inferior status. By reducing inequality, we would not only reduce the powerful contribution it makes to poverty, but also weaken the damaging grip of class and status differences on us all. You are reinforcing the powerful contribution that inequality makes to poverty, promoting its damaging grip on us all. You are doing that by demolishing the homes of the most deprived council tenants in the borough to make way for upmarket homeowners. Where could there be a greater contrast of equality? That is an abuse of power, similar to those we've seen in Kensington and Chelsea and Southwark. I think Aditya Chakrabarty was right to suggest it shows contempt for the council tenants. On top of all that, the leader of the council wrote in The Guardian, the risk of doing nothing, of accepting decline, the failed market and substantial housing, is much, much worse. Not so. You perpetuate the decline which was set in motion by the 1979 Thatcher government. HDV exploits land values which have been raised and inflated by national and international property speculators like Lend-Lease since 1979. The HD will use methods which speculators for private profit have been allowed to create the failed market. You're joining the people who created the failed market, substandard affordable housing, for Londoners in particular. It's like joining the Gadarene swine before they drag the whole economy over the cliff. There will be other financial crises, and you will be part of it. And that is confidently predicted by the most reliable economists. Meanwhile, Lend-Lease, based in Australia, with a company in a Channel Islands tax haven, will use every means at its disposal, both legal and hidden, to cheat the British taxpayers of revenue. If you could draw your comments to a close, which ought to be used to maintain nurses, teachers, police, public emergency services, and the standard of living they work for but do not receive.
Thank you very much. Just a question from me to start. So, yes. I've heard you speak very eloquently about the scourge of poverty and inequality, but what I didn't get from your deputation is what you would like to see the council doing instead. If you could just address that question, and then I'll have a look around and see if there are any other cabinet member questions.
I'd like to see the council drop the whole idea. But in particular, to join the Labour Party and to bring the Labour Party, make the Labour Party united, and start working on a proper land policy for the United Kingdom. We need one. You are the people who could bring it in. You, instead of exploiting the crisis of land that has been created by the Lend-Lease and developers of this world, you could actually sit back and take a look and produce something like the land value tax, which is an entirely progressive tax, and a far, far better way of running the country than we currently have, where it's the rich and powerful who take the land, and that means that your tenants get ever higher rents. They are landless tenants. The inequality in wealth gets worse and worse, and you are now contributing to it. It is a classic mistake, and you should not be doing it.
Okay, if you could turn your microphone off, Reverend Nicholson. I don't see any other questions. So, sorry, Councillor Arthur.
Thank you for the deputation. One of the things that you said which struck me was that we are ultimately doing this in order to bring in upmarket homeowners and showing contempt for current council tenants. And when I look at the proposals that we have at the moment, I think one of the things that we're making really unequivocal commitments to do is A, get a right of return so that those council tenants would be able to come back, and secondly, to ensure that new housing, 40% of it, is affordable. So I wanted to see why those proposals... So I wanted to get a sense of why those proposals you think are looking purely at supporting high-income, new residents, or why you think it is the case that we're showing contempt to current residents when we're saying that they will have a right of return.
I don't accept the notion that you should do it at all. I think the creation, the destruction of community is extraordinarily serious. However deprived people may be, they have their own networks of mutual support and love. And you are simply tearing it apart, digging them up and sending them out and say you have a right to return. It is absolutely not on. As far as affordable housing is concerned, I really do think all politicians, and I just actually asked David Lammy to do the same by Twitter, which is when you talk about affordable housing, you should say housing which is affordable according to income. What happens now is that housing is affordable according to market, and it's a disaster. In fact, there is information out today from the National Policy Institute showing that the private rented sector has doubled the rents. Now, if you double the rents and you have stagnant incomes, which is what we have now, and what you're about to go into, will be, in fact, mean that people have less money to pay food, clothes, fuel, transport, and other necessities. You're creating a financial crisis in the homes of the most deprived people in the borough of Haringey, and that is not on.
Councillor Arthur.
I'm sorry.
So firstly, I completely agree with you on the need to ensure that affordable actually means affordable. And I think based on our housing strategy... Based on our housing strategy at the moment, I think you referred to affordable housing being linked to incomes, and that's what our housing strategy actually explicitly says, that it should be linked to incomes rather than a market rent, because 80% isn't affordable. So I think the Cabinet supports you there. Sorry, just to move on to the question. So I'll bring you back to I think the question that the leader asked and has been asked by Councillor Goldberg as well, about working with and waiting for a Labour government. I absolutely agree that it would be fantastic as a council to be able to work with the National Labour Party to ensure that we have housing policies, land policies that support more affordable housing, genuinely affordable housing. But given that we don't have a sense as a group collectively at the moment when that's going to happen, what would you say we should be doing now to tackle inequality of the scale that you can see whilst we wait for that Labour government?
I'm absolutely certain you should be campaigning for those things now. Instead of putting your land, £2 billion worth of it, into a market. Even though you've got 50% in charge of it, you're not going to have proper control of it. And I don't actually buy the whole question about you're going to have affordable housing. I don't actually buy what was said by Alan Strickland about the viability assessments. I think when the pressure comes and you've got the normal situation arising when you've got a developer developing a site, they're going to need to make a profit. You are saying you want to make a profit, then the whole thing will be guided by profit. And therefore your assessments will be guided by profit. And to make assurances on viability assessment at this stage, when we haven't seen a viability assessment, is really most irresponsible.
If you could turn your microphone off, I'm going to turn to Councillor Strickland to respond to you. And I'd really like you to pick up particularly the question of land that Reverend Nicholson raised. If you just turn your microphone off, because Alan won't be able to turn his on until you turn your mic off.
I'm sorry.
Thank you, Reverend Nicholson. So Why don't I start with the land question? So I absolutely agree with you that one of the biggest problems in London in particular, and other capital cities, is that a lot of value that's generated from land is not because anybody's building on it, they're not doing anything useful with it. You know, what happens a lot in London is that property companies sell land to each other for years and years and years. Nothing's ever built on it, and they turn up a planning committee saying, because I paid this ludicrous amount for land, I can't possibly build affordable housing. I couldn't agree with you more. That's one of the reasons why we are not doing what many councils across London, many Labour councils, as you know, Reverend, have done, which is to say, here's an estate that desperately needs investment and regeneration, and we're going to put a for sale sign on it and sell it to a housing association or to a developer. We're not doing that at all. One of the reasons for going down this partnership route, having travelled around the country as part of a cross-party group looking at the options, is because we want to reject the way the London housing market works, and we want to actively intervene in that market. So the council using its land in a partnership where we've got directors on the company, where we've got control, where we get half of the profit, absolutely, I think, stops that speculative resale. That's what we're trying to, part of what we're trying to stop. Going back to your wider point, I absolutely agree with you that, as a Labour council, and we make this very clear in our documents and our speeches, that tackling inequality is absolutely our top priority. I also.
Okay, I think we've got that everyone doesn't agree with that, but we need to continue. So we've heard what you said, Councillor Strickland.
Thank you very much. But it is not, I agree with that, but it's not true to say that the purpose of this is to demolish affordable housing to make way for private homes. That's not what's happening at all. This council has a borough-wide policy on rehousing. Many London boroughs do not have that. We're strengthening that policy at the moment to guarantee a right to return. Many London boroughs do not guarantee a right to return. It is clear, when you compare us to other boroughs, that we are going beyond what other people are doing. Just to pick up some of the social sides of inequality you quite rightly mentioned, I think that's a critical point, because when you read the documents and you read the various business plans, when you read the documents and various business plans, what we make very clear is that the development vehicle is fundamentally not just about building things. It's about community facilities, it's about tackling health inequalities, it's about building new and better school buildings, and that's why we recently were awarded a very significant grant to employ more staff in the people side of our regeneration team to keep expanding the work we're doing on skills, schools, mental health and other areas. And finally, I just wanted to pick up the point around communities. You are completely right that when you look at evidence from around London, particularly from the past and the 60s, 70s redevelopments that happened, residents were scattered around London, scattered around the country. There was no pretence of keeping together communities. That is a world away from what we're doing. That's why we have been so keen to guarantee the right to return, because we absolutely believe that strong communities should remain strong communities, and that's why many people in Northumberland Park, if they want to stay, in fact would never leave Northumberland Park. They would move within the development as it happens.
So I think the right to return...
Reverend Nicholson, you need to turn your microphone off, or I can't...
the right to return is really a rather unhelpful thing. When you've already disrupted the education of the families, you've broken the communities. I totally understand you're deeply committed to something you spent hours putting together. But I'm afraid at the end of it, you've forgotten the human beings underneath it. You've forgotten the chaos of the current market and the fact that you're putting people into that market. You have forgotten there is a market out there. The rents are far too high, the incomes are far too low and stagnating, and you're throwing them out into it with a great deal of passion for your idea, but it's a bad idea.
Right, Reverend... you turn your mic off. Thank you very much for coming this evening. Thank you for your deputation. And I'm now going to call on Mr Howder to come forward and make his... If you wish to stay, you're welcome to go up to the gallery and see the rest of the meeting. Thank you very much. Yes, of course. If you want to have one or two of your deputation party to come forward, or all three of you, that's fine. If you just take a seat, then, Mr Howder. So, as I've explained to the previous deputations, when I turn my microphone off, you'll be able to turn yours on. You have 3 minutes in which to make your deputation. I'm then going to ask any Cabinet members to have questions, to ask their questions, to put those to you, and then I'm going to ask Councillor Goldberg to respond to your deputation. So, as soon as you're ready, please turn your microphone on and make a start. Thank you.
Respectable Chair, Honourable Member of the Cabinet. My name is Dhirendra Haldar. I am the Council of Asian People Chair for the time being. And the Secretary is Anu and Treasurer is Mr. Bhatt, and she is also new young lady joined with us. We are the community center, whose name is now Community Hub Haringey. Formerly, it was Asian Center. And we have been here working for the community, with the council, for the council people, last more than 36 years. And this moment, we are very much worried about our existence. The center is going to be demolished. Building will be demolished. And we do not know where we are going to do the service for the community, for the Haringey. We come here to draw the attention of the decision maker. You are taking decision who is building to be demolished and where they will go. We want to know sure about it, where we are going when the building is demolished. That is our main question. We have not yet heard anything. We have got recently a letter that you will be the first victim of the HDB demolishing your center, Northumberland Park, and then might be together with us, community center. I don't know any other community center is going to be demolished. Why then this one? Maybe we saw the councillor Strickland and he said, you are in the center place, so we have to demolish this area and we have to develop it. It's a logical proposal. We believe it. And we always work with the council. But we are not sure where we are going. That is our question. And then next door to us, we proposed that next door, if you move from there to another place, our elderly people or who are our service,
Mr. Holder, could you draw your comments to a close?
Yeah, so we are very much concerned about the proposed HDB and if it's going our building in that period. So that is our main question. And I ought.
Thank you very much. If I could ask you to turn your microphone off, I'll see if Cabinet members have any questions for you. I will see if Cabinet members have any questions, and then, as you'll note from the previous deputations, the answers will come from the Cabinet member, who I'll ask to respond after that. So I just have one question for you. I'd understood that in the last week or two that you'd met with council officers explicitly to talk about the HDV and relocation plans, and I just wondered, Mr Howder, were you in that meeting, and how did that go for you?
Well, so far I know, the center manager, Santosh Chandran, he is dealing directly with her. And then we got a letter very lately, that you will be the first victim and maybe your building will go first. That is why we are very much worried.
So if I understand correctly, you weren't actually in the meeting, it was the centre manager who was at the meeting, because I know one of the officers who met with you is here. I believe you met with them, didn't you, Helen? Anyway, I'm going to ask Councillor Goldberg. I can't see any other questions. Councillor Goldberg, to respond to some of the points raised by Mr Howder, and I think particularly the point that he's getting at is the very legitimate point around reprovision of his centre, which we know fulfils and has fulfilled a very important role in Haringey for the last 36 years or so, 40 years, I think.
Thank you, Leader. Before I answer directly, I think it's important to address the really seminal point which you're making, which is around community organisations and buildings in Haringey. For me, in the entire time that I've been in the Cabinet, community buildings have presented an issue alongside how do we manage our organisation to have a great and strong relationship with, alongside our ambitions for regeneration. And I say that because Councillor Meehan would have really impressed upon me, and Lord Harris also impressed upon me when I first arrived in Haringey, that what Haringey did very differently in the 70s and 80s was to recognise each and every ethnic group within our borough. And as someone who is an ethnic minority myself, I understand deeply and profoundly the importance that each community feels they have a distinct home within the borough. Maybe it's a shared home, but some place that they can call a collective home, and they can gather and perform collective actions, whether that be prayer, whether that just be gathering, whether that be looking after old, it doesn't really matter. Actually, that has been a strong asset, and it has driven, I believe, the cohesion that exists in Haringey, and that makes Haringey a rather unique borough with London compared to others. It's why I say that because I want people to understand that, say with real conviction, that using the word victim with regards to it, I realise that there will be inconvenience for the association and for the hub. But the issue of the hub and the mosque in Wood Green is related to really the Wood Green area plan, though it is also covered by the Haringey Development Vehicle. So I want to make something very clear. The Wood Green Library development site is currently proposed in Wood Green Business Plan, indicates the council-owned land at 6 to 10 Caxton Road, which is your address, the community hub, the TICC and the FDL Community Centre. And during procurement, the boundaries for all the sites in the Haringey Development Vehicle were set to reflect the local plan, what we call the DPD, in our site allocations to ensure the development which comes forward is comprehensive and coordinated with the wider area in line with current planning policy. The site allocation boundaries are different in the new draft for Green AAP because we need to respond to some of the consultation issues that came first in our first round. But the council owned land at 610 is still within the development site, which is why we're having this conversation. We've spoken to you, which the leader addressed, and we're very clear that developing that land as part of the shopping centre, as part of the library site, and as part of Crossrail 2 coming to Wood Green is really key to regenerating Wood Green. Having said all that, as I said to you, the value of your organisation, your building is important, and it's recognised not just by me, but it's recognised in the Wood Green Business Plan documents, in the EQI. Specific reference is made to these assets, and actually the HCV needs to be required to work with them through any redevelopment. What does that actually mean? So let me be really clear. The current draft plan, which we just finished consultation on the AP, states that adequate reprovision for space to the communities should be provided prior to redevelopment. That means that we cannot go ahead with development at sites until we have found a site that's agreeable to you. A new location for the facilities outlined will need to be identified, and a deliverable relocation strategy, a means to get you to move your organisation to said new building so it's up and working, all needs to happen before, within our planning policy framework and our policies, it needs to be delivered within that plan. Land can then only be transferred to this development vehicle with vacant possession. In other words, you have to be in a new building that you're happy with before the land gets transferred to the HDV. I'm trying to answer the organisation's question. And so we'll have to work with you to agree where you want to go, what your needs are going forward, and before any redevelopment can take place. As I said, I'm really clear that there has to be a home for your organisations within Wood Green. We need to find you a home. I've already asked officers to start looking at sites. that have become vacant because of the cuts that were made because of austerity, see whether there are alternative suitable buildings. So, well, because of the cuts made by the Tory government to our budgets means that some of our buildings are located. Well, so I think hopefully that answers your question.
Okay. Mr Howder, thank you very much for making your deputation this evening.
To answer this question.
There isn't really provision for this. If you
because
want to...
we want...
Mr.
What
Howder,
we lastly say...
Sorry, Mr Howder, just one moment.
A place
Mr Howder, I'll give you... Mr Howder, I've given the other two deputations a moment to come back, but really just a moment, because it's really outside the rules, but I want to offer you the same fairness that everyone else. So if you could just keep your comment very brief, because then we need to move on. But do go ahead.
But sorry, can I not answer the question?
The deputation process is quite clear. You make a statement, you then have questions, and then the cabinet member responds. And as the Constitution says, that's the end of it.
We have got to reply to that answer what he has given, because we are not sure still what he said, that where we will be going, and that is we are not sure.
Okay, so
we want to be assurance from you that we need a place before we move.
Okay, so let me try once more. If you turn your microphone off, let me just try and summarise, and then we'll have to end your deputation. So what I heard Councillor Goldberg say is that we're absolutely committed to the value of your community organisation, as well as many other community organisations that exist in Wood Green. As the Wood Green plan identifies that the site that your centre is currently on should be redeveloped, that the guarantee that he is offering to you is that we will work with you to find a Wood Green location for you to be relocated to, a site that you are happy with as an organisation, and an undertaking that your new building will be open and you will be in situ in that new building before anything happens with your current building. So I hope that offers the reassurance that you were seeking. Thank you for the work again that you do in the borough, and thanks for your time this evening. We do need to move on, but thank you very much to all four of you. Okay, we're going to move on then to item 8, which is matters referred to the Cabinet by the Overview and Scrutiny Committee. So that means we're coming on to consider the scrutiny review of the Haringey Development Vehicle Part 2, which has been completed by the Housing and Regeneration Scrutiny Panel. The Cabinet Member for Housing, Regeneration and Planning will provide the Cabinet response to the review recommendations. But first, can I ask Councillor Ibrahim, the Chair of the panel, to introduce the review. Councillor Ibrahim, whenever you're ready.
Okay, so if I introduce myself, my name is Councillor Amina Ibrahim. I'm Councillor for Haringey Ward. I sit on the Overview and Scrutiny Committee, and I chair the Housing and Regeneration Scrutiny Panel. As many of you will be aware, earlier on in the year we presented a scrutiny report which was primarily focused on the governance arrangements for the scrutiny, for the Haringey Development Vehicle, and we provided an overarching recommendation which was part of the evidence that we gathered, that over the months of doing the project we became increasingly concerned about whether the development vehicle was in fact going to effectively protect the interests of the council, because the original terms of reference were specifically on governance arrangements. We decided as a result to do a second report which would cover all of the issues that we were not able to cover in the earlier report. Now what we decided to do was to, because obviously it was a controversial report at the time, and because we provided an overarching recommendation, we felt that we wanted to delve a little bit deeper into that. So what we did was we went out there with the help of officers and with the help of councillors who are, I can see some of them are here tonight. We looked out there into the field and we gathered evidence from various sources, from experts experts in the field from universities, from local residents and from various think tanks. So we can include, we spoke to professors from UCL, from London Metropolitan, and also somebody from the Centre for London, as well as some of the Cabinet member came down from Oxford District Council, but that's only a small number of the people that we spoke to, and the report itself speaks for itself, and all of that evidence is included as appendices. After that, after the completion of that evidence gathering, we drew together 30 recommendations. We don't have an overarching recommendation this time. However, what I'm going to do, because I know I've got a limited amount of time, is draw attention to two in particular recommendations that were concerned have not been fully agreed by Cabinet. So you'll see in the report that there's a lot of detail around some of the recommendations that have either been agreed or partially agreed. Now, one of the ones that I'd like to draw people's attention is the exclusivity clause. So if you go to that, which is recommendation 12, I believe. So one of the issues...
Page 54.
Yeah, sorry. That's right, it's on page 54, and that's where the main recommendation is. However, the Cabinet response is later on in the document. Our main concern around exclusivity, and at the time when we made that recommendation, we did not know as a committee what the percentage was. We only found that out later when it became public information as well. And our issues and our concerns around that are to do with best value requirements of the council. Now, because of the life of this project is going to be proposed to be 20 years, we are concerned that what presents best value today may not do so in 15 years. Now, we've received some assurances saying that there will be best value recommendations for each and every site, and what we'd said is if this did happen, it should be on a site-by-site basis. Our concern is once you sign up to a contractual agreement today, when you sign on the dotted line, it will be difficult, if not impossible, at a later date to suggest that actually we don't commit to that 60% and we go somewhere else, and there may be cost implications to that as well. So that's my initial concern about that recommendation. There is also and I'll refer you to, one second. While I'm looking for that, I will make a further comment. So this week we received something like 1,500 pages of documents. This wasn't information that was available to the Scrutiny Committee throughout its process. It's new information for us. I've been going through it. As you can see, I've got my post-it notes, but I found it quite a huge task. And I can see actually from people's tables that there's nearly as much exempt information as well. That's a lot of information for people to digest in a short period of time. So I think, again, our concerns...
Do you want to come on to the other recommendation?
Yes, sorry, I have got sidetracked there, Claire. So, if you want to... So again, the recommendation on the commitment to... and I'll find out which number it is. It's on the commitment to right to return. Now, I'm glad to see that we are now being informed that there are going to be guarantees on this. However, when I look into the document, and I believe it's page, I'm sure Cabinet have read it, it's 995. Sorry, yeah. Is it 99? No, it's not 992, Zena. It's no, it's page 989 actually. It's 989 of the big white pack. And on page, so on item, sorry, I'll wait for people to find that document. It's 1.4.1, and there it says secure council tenants will be offered rehousing and statutory home loss disturbance payments. I can't see a commitment there to right of return.
Councillor Ibrahim, I can address that point directly. So if I refer you to the Cabinet meeting held on the 20th of June, which had all of the points and set out very clearly the Council's policy approach in relation to tenants, leaseholders and indeed freeholders. I just refer you to that.
So are you saying that's incorrect?
No, I'm not saying it's incorrect.
So could that be added to that then?
I'm saying that it makes very clear, the document that went to Cabinet on the 20th of June, that policy applies to all housing schemes in the borough. It also applies to housing associations. In fact, Mr Burnham made reference to that in his deputation, and it makes explicit reference to the fact that it applies to the HDV. So while I accept that this is a shorthand version, the Council's policy documents govern all of this, and as I say, it is explicitly clear. You've had your 5 minutes now. I was going to turn to any questions, firstly from Cabinet members, but then I also know that the Leader of the Opposition has a question. But thank you for your presentation. Any Cabinet member questions? I don't see any. In which case, Councillor Engert, you notified me of a question.
Thank you, Chair. As a member of the Housing Regen Scrutiny Panel, and also on behalf of the Lib Dem councillors, I should like to say how disappointing the Cabinet response to our latest scrutiny has been. That said, I have 4 questions, and I would like to underline what Amina said about the papers. Most of these papers we'd never seen as a scrutiny committee, so much for your pronouncement about transparency, and the fact that the yellow pack of excluded papers no public person can see. It's just about as big as the ordinary pack. So it's just what I wanted to underline. I was concerned by the response to the committee's recommendation on the role of the Scrutiny Committee in scrutinising the HGV, as stated on pages 81 and 96. If the committee or panel decides to review HGV activities, will you ensure that information is provided to the committee and the HGV officers attend the meeting when requested to do so? Would you like me to go through all 4 questions? The second question is, Council policy states there should be full disclosure of viability assessments. However, there is a rather unclear answer on page 90 to the request by the committee there should be full disclosure of HGV viability assessments. Can you clarify, will HGV viability assessments be published or not? And if so, will they be redacted, rather like the papers we received today? I also want to underline the issue that was brought up by the first deputation, which is for people's references on page 91, which states there may need to be different building cores for different tenures. Again, I read that as possible pour doors. I know you've responded to it, but I want it on record. And on page 92, the response to the request for the HGV not to develop metropolitan open land, many of which are green spaces, is very weak. Rather than saying it is unlikely, will the Cabinet now commit to not building or developing metropolitan open land? Thank you.
Councillor Strickland, when you've finished scribbling down a note of the questions, if I ask you first to respond to Councillor Engert, and then we'll come back to any other questions from Cabinet members, and then we'll take your response to Councillor Ibrahim.
Thank you very much. So firstly, in terms of the role of the Scrutiny Committee, I think the report is clear that we continue to see the committee having a very important role going forward. Lend-Lease have said, as have the Council, that HGV staff would go to that committee and be happy to answer questions. So I don't see a big challenge there in terms of the committee's work. Just as people from the NHS, the police, Veolia and other sort of external partners that contract with the Council come to the committee, the same would be true here. Secondly, I'll bring in Dan in terms of the viability question. But in terms of the different building cores, I'll just repeat what I said earlier, which is that this is something we always strongly discourage applicants from doing. We're very clear that we would rather people had a shared entrance, but it depends on the building and the design, and sometimes housing associations or other affordable housing providers put forward very strong arguments for wanting to have a separate entrance to keep the costs down to their tenants and to keep the service charges down for their tenants. So what this report makes clear is just being honest. It's just being honest. It's just being honest about the situation, and as I say, that request usually comes from the affordable housing provider, not the developer. In terms of metropolitan open land, I think what the report does make clear is that metropolitan open land has one of the toughest planning protections of any type of land. There are no plans to develop on metropolitan open land, and what the report simply says is, were any ideas to come forward, they would have to be subject to an incredibly stringent test. Dan, can I ask you to pick up the viability question?
Yes, I just add that in a way that the principles put forward by the Council and then in respect to the HDV map exactly onto what is anyway the policy of the planning department and the Council, which is that the starting presumption is that all viability assessments should be published in full as part of the consideration of the planning applications, and that the burden of proof is on any developer to show where some part of the viability assessment might need to be withheld if they can show that it's commercially confidential for one reason or another. But the strong presumption is on publication, and the burden of proof will be on the HTV just as it's on any other developer to show why that is not justified.
Thanks, Councillor Strickland. I'll just add, Councillor Engert, if you turn to page 109, 5.8 and of the supplementary pack, and 5.81, you will see that in terms of the legal agreement, it says the parties have agreed the following principle in respect of the relocation of secure council tenants. Every secure tenant in any demolition phase or who is otherwise required by the council to move for the purposes of the development shall have a right to return. I just refer you to that. I'm going to take... I saw one other question from Councillor Brabazon. Right, Councillor Brabazon, then Councillor Tucker, Councillor Carter. Councillors, I'm going to take these, but you had been asked to notify in advance. We've got a lot of papers and a lot of the agenda and a lot of questions to get through this evening. So I will there is absolutely no rush this evening. There's a lot of business to get through. Councillor Brabazon, you first, please.
I want to follow up the point about the papers. We have 1,500 pages of papers that we got a week before. We've been conducting a scrutiny for 9 months. From January, when this was agreed to go forward to the Cabinet in February, you wanted 5 months or so to set up the papers. We held a second scrutiny. My question is why these papers, 545 pages of these papers are still in draft. Why were papers not given to us if you really believe that scrutiny is important and that it is a check and balance, Alan, which is what you say, and I believe you believe it. Why didn't you give us some of these papers, even in early draft, like the member agreement, so that we could begin to scrutinise it properly? Because fundamentally, we have worked with no papers from the other side, the executive, and the role of scrutiny should be to scrutinise, to advise, to warn. That is good governance. And I am really upset, Claire and Alan, that we didn't have the papers, because we've tried the best we can, but we were working with a blank piece of paper. We found all the witnesses for the scrutiny across a wide spectrum ourselves. It is a pity. I hope you read the evidence that they provided. But tell me, Alan, why couldn't we have had some of these papers 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks ago when clearly they were in draft? They're still in draft. Thank you.
Councillor Tucker, I'm going to... right, if you can ask all your questions, and we're going to move straight to Councillor Tucker, and then Councillor Carter, if you want to come and have a seat. Sorry, just 1 second. Councillor Brabazon,
Yes.
just one moment. Councillor Carter, what we'll do is take Councillor Brabazon's second question straight to Councillor Tucker and then straight to yourself, and then we'll bundle them all up for answers from Councillor Strickland and officers as required. Councillor Brabazon.
The second question concerns one of the recommendations in the pack, which was that the Council should support an independent advisor to the Council representatives, particularly the councillor who is going to sit on the HDV board, should the HDV go ahead. Now, we thought this was a very sensible recommendation which would give the Council some security and support in what are complex issues. I don't know, I hope you've all read the papers, but even if you just read these, it's hugely complex. Our worry as a committee is that Lend-Lease will know more about this than we will, and that therefore they may run rings round us, as the deputies have said. So in the interest of ensuring that the Council is protected, I would like to know why you rejected that recommendation, since we've spent 1.67 million already on lawyers, consultants and all the rest of it. It would seem at the final 11th hurdle to protect the Council's interests, an independent advisor sourced independently to support us to make the best of this that we possibly can, given the circumstances in which we find ourselves.
Councillor Tucker, sorry, Councillor Ibrahim, why are you raising your hand?
Well, because I didn't get to cover my last overarching recommendation, I'd like to pose it as a question.
Fine, I'll come to that at the end. Let me tack it on after Councillor Carter. Councillor Tucker, please.
Yes, we are going into an enormous mega million deal with a much more enormous mega billion international corporation whose primary duty is to maximise profits for its shareholders and its executives. And scrutiny, it seems to me, have done a very good piece of work in seeking to pin down some issues in order to try and close off the possibility of Lend-Lease via the HDV being able to reduce the number of social housing units and homes in the borough and thereby increase their profits. Now, I want to home in on a couple of questions, and one of them may look technical, but it's very important. And that is, what is the date on which the number of habitable rooms of social housing property, of council property, is going to be calculated? There isn't actually an answer to that. It's asked very, very clearly in the scrutiny report. The scrutiny report recommends that that be calculated before there is any consultation or engagement with the residents. So that's my first question. What is the date on which that can be calculated? Secondly, I would like to ask, and again it's not answered here, how has Cabinet considered closing off the possible routes for Lend-Lease via the HDV to start reducing the number of habitable rooms, bearing in mind that we're not actually even talking about re-providing the number of units, we're talking about reducing the number of units and re-providing the number of habitable rooms. But what are we doing, or what is there in the enormous documents that we've been provided to close off the possibility of Lend-Lease doing what they will inevitably do, and which they do everywhere, which is reduce the amount of social housing to maximise their profits? Can I raise one possible route and ask Cabinet if and where that is addressed? And that is for Lend-Lease to produce a viability report which says that they're not making enough profits and therefore they've got to reduce the amount of affordable housing below 40% and the amount of equivalent council housing below the set amount. They then presumably need to convince the HDV of that, which means the council representatives supporting it, and then it needs to go through Cabinet, and they need to persuade Cabinet. So if they can do those three things, they can thereby reduce the amount of equivalent council properties available in the borough via the HDV.
Councillor Carter. Councillor Carter, your question?
Oh, thank you, Chair. It's about the documentation. I think we've partly covered this, or some of this already. It's a question for Alan Strickland, Councillor. I'm sure you've read all the papers that tower about 3 or 4 inches, including the 545 pages which are marked draft and therefore subject to change. I notice there are also 75 instances of the term redacted material. We don't know if that's just a few words or just a few pages. The exempt appendices number 90 pages. Now, I'm sure you've read all this, but would you accept that the public can't read all this, that this is fantastically opaque? And I've learnt this earlier this afternoon that there may be 1,200 other pages that we have not seen. Now, I'm really thinking of the public, including the people up in the public gallery there, and indeed some of the rather loud people outside. Would you agree that this is an opaque process? That's my first question. Thank you.
Councillor Carter, I'm not sure if you missed my point. I just asked that everyone ask all of their questions. I'm then going to turn to Councillor Ibrahim.
All right, second and last question. In view of the letter, which I'm sure we're all aware of, from the 2 MPs that cover all of this borough, David Lammy and Catherine West, calling for a halt to the vehicle, and they've raised a large number of items, especially to do with fire protection in view of what has happened at Grenfell. That's the reason I'm wearing a black armband here. Will you be taking on board what they've said, which is requesting that this be paused? I would go further, but that is what the 2 MPs have asked for. Thank you.
And Councillor Ibrahim, you were going to phrase your contribution as a question.
So the main recommendation as well that we've made is on number 1, which is that the original business case was in 2015. That's a really long time ago. It was before Brexit. It was before the snap general election. It was before there were doubts around whether Crossrail would happen. So the response suggests that the business plan and the documents that we're looking at now should cover that. However, what we would say is that a business case is fundamentally something different. It's about reviewing whether we're in a current political and financial climate that we were in 2015, and where this may have looked attractive then, it may not look so now. So I'd like to ask why, in essence, that recommendation has not been accepted fully, but also our recommendation on target rents. Now, the response on that is quite vague, and it talks about affordability. And when I look in the documents, the information in the business plan, again, it talks about affordability. It doesn't talk about target rents. And I suppose my question to the Cabinet member would be, will the social housing offer be calculated at target rent? That's a specific formula, so it's not a percentage. It's a specific formula which would be equal to current rents.
Okay, Councillor Strickland, I know you've got a note, and I suspect you'll want to bring officers in, but can you start on those questions, please?
Thank you very much. So there were a bunch of questions then around the papers and whether this is an opaque process, and I would feel very strongly that it is not. This is the 3rd time this has been to Cabinet. It's been discussed, obviously, repeatedly here and in other forums. And as I said, other councils taking similar decisions have not published all of the sort of information that we've published this evening. We've made a determined choice to publish everything we possibly can, and that's why we've ended up with that volume of paperwork. What I would say is, in terms of the scrutiny process, to answer your question, as your second question, Councillor Brabazon, is that the scrutiny committee undertaken a very valuable piece of work, but it was always clear that that piece of work was happening while the discussions with Lend-Lease were going on, while agreements were being reached, while documents were being drafted, and therefore I think it's always been clear that a lot of these documents would not be ready until they were prepared for Cabinet, and that we were clear that scrutinising an ongoing process necessarily means there will not be finished documents to look at. And Councillor Carter, in terms of answering your question, your question on the letter and fire protection, we, like other councils, and I've circulated information to members, have taken very urgent steps across the borough in our own stock and elsewhere on fire safety. In terms of blocks that may be built by the HGV in the future, these are some years away, and that will be by the time that the public inquiry has reported, and I would expect that building regulations by that point would have been changed. So it will be in that light that any decisions in terms of the detail of buildings will be made. But it's important to say that the papers this evening do not talk about design or any of that detail. That would all be looked at later through the normal planning process in consultation with residents, where everything would be scrutinised by planning officers, building control officers, and building control work closely with the London Fire Brigade to check the fire safety of buildings. Councillor Brabazon, I think I've answered your points there. You had a final point, which is in terms of the having an independent advisor sitting on the board. So we have and have received excellent external advice from external legal advisors, financial advisors and procurement advisors, and the Council will continue to access external advice for as long as it needs it. Equally, we have they're sitting behind me, some of them. So I think we're being very transparent about this. Equally, we have very experienced senior staff who've been working on this. We also talk in our scrutiny response about a significant allocation of internal audit resource being put to this. So there is a lot of resource going in. Equally, the main Cabinet report talks about the independent verification team, and this means that before any contract can be given to Lend-Lease through the arrangements discussed, through the exclusivity agreement, that an independent team made up of a variety of professionals has to produce a report, and it's only on the basis of that advice that the board can act. So there is significant provision of ongoing independent advice. Councillor Tucker, in terms of your questions, you're absolutely right, the scrutiny worked very hard on this, and I welcome that very much. But it's also important to say that these documents have been scrutinised by external lawyers and external advisors. There's been really intense scrutiny of what's here and what has been proposed by Lend-Lease. In terms of when dates of affordable housing will be calculated, I think we've always been clear that this is actually a slow, incremental process over time, where sites would go in slowly only when there'd been a public consultation, when there is a planning permission, and when Cabinet are satisfied with what's being proposed. That's when land goes in, and it's at that point, in some cases well into the future, that detailed decisions will be made. Now, Council board members will clearly be pushing to maximise affordable homes at all times, so I don't think we can give an arbitrary figure now beyond what we've said in terms of 40% and right to return. There is no intention at all, which I said to you at the last Cabinet when you asked the same question, to reduce affordable housing, and I've already set out the process that decides how land goes in. So I think you suggested, Councillor Tucker, that viability assessments would be looked at only if the board members were happy, only if the Cabinet was happy, only if. That's absolutely right. No, as I said earlier, no decision on affordable housing could be made until all of those checks and balances have been gone through. There's very significant protection. Finally, Councillor Ibrahim, so in terms of the business case, you're quite right that was done some time ago, and the world has changed in a variety of ways. But as you mentioned, a significant amount of additional work has happened since then. So the financial assessments and the business plan work that's gone on, just to reassure you, does supersede that original business case. There is more information here, it's more detailed, and it's more up to date. Dan, can I just ask you to pick up the question in terms of rent policy?
So the first thing to say is that, of course, the replacement housing for the existing estates and the homes into which existing tenants would be rehoused will be at the target rents. The rest of the affordable housing will be at a mix of rents as defined as affordable in the housing strategy. So, right, but what it does say, both in the business plans and in the legal agreements, is that the HDV schemes have to comply with the housing strategy, and the housing strategy sets out very clearly what mix the council expects in terms of the mix of tenures, as it were, within that affordable allocation. So the position is that the HDV sticks to that mix as set out.
How much target rent is that?
Okay, you finished on your answer. Okay, Councillor Strickland. No, Councillor Brabazon, we're going now to the Cabinet Member response to the scrutiny review. We took those questions. We'll then move on. When we move on to the consideration of the paper, I know that you'd indicated you have a question, but let's deal with the scrutiny report at the current time. So, Councillor Strickland, can I ask you to respond to the scrutiny report?
Thank you very much. So I firstly wanted to start by thanking the scrutiny panel very much for their hard work. I know how hard you worked. I know you've worked incredibly conscientiously to get expert witnesses from around the country and really think about this properly. And I do genuinely feel that this is a big decision for the council, and I do genuinely appreciate that as well as cabinet members and officers having worked on this for 2 years. I can say that 2 years doesn't feel like a rush to me. Equally, I know scrutiny as well have put huge amounts of time into this over an extended period of time, for which I'm very grateful. Now, I have to say most of the points I wanted to pick out, Leader, in terms of responding at the high priority points, Councillor Ibrahim has quietly raised already. So let me just check to see whether there's anything that's been missed. But I have to say I was going to talk about just a few quick things I wanted to mention. Points were made about the commercial portfolio, and there have been concerns raised by councillors that about all of that going in from day one. As the response makes clear, that's no longer going in on day one. The commercial portfolio will now go in on a phased basis over time, which I think is very helpful indeed. I just wanted to emphasise, you raised questions around residents' rights, and just to emphasise what we said earlier, where the Leader made clear that I took a report to the last Cabinet to further strengthen our policy and our commitments, and the Leader's points out that it's also captured in the Land Assembly Agreement and other documents that are in front of you. I think, given that the points were raised, Leader, what I would just say in summary is there are a number of points around housing, around jobs, around the commercial portfolio, and I really want to emphasise what the Assistant Director said, which is that on housing, the development vehicle is bound by the Council's housing strategy, which was subject to repeat public consultation. On jobs and growth and what type of businesses it seeks to bring to the borough, that is determined by the growth strategy. And in terms of the right to return and the very important protections, not just for tenants but for leaseholders, again, that is as determined and set out in the rehousing policy. So existing policies that have already been consulted on, have already been agreed by residents and by Cabinet, really do place some significant burdens on the HGV and are really important in making sure that residents' priorities shape what happens.
Okay. That's fine. Okay, so Cabinet members, can I ask you, Cabinet members, to turn to page 25 and 26 of your agenda pack, and I'd like to draw your attention to paragraph 3, 3.1 and 3.2. Now, they contain the recommendations that you're asked to agree. So it is to agree the responses to the overview and scrutiny report recommendations, which are attached as Appendix 2. Can I ask Cabinet to agree those recommendations? Is that agreed? Thank you, everyone. Okay. We then move on to item 10 on the agenda pack, the Haringey Development Vehicle, financial close and establishment. Thanks, members. If I can ask you to take a seat, and I'll call you forward as we take questions. So, as I set out before, this report has exempt information to be considered in the private part of the meeting. So what we'll do is consider the recommendations set out at 3.1, subject to considering the exempt information at item 16. The public appendices to the report were included at pages 97 to 1474 of the second pack of papers for ease of reference. Cabinet, can I ask you in particular to note the equalities comments in the report? They are at section 8.49 to 8.57. I'd also draw your attention to the equalities impacts assessments, which were completed for the strategic business plans for Northumberland Park. That's at Appendix 3B of your pack. Wood Green at Appendix 4B, Cranwood at Appendix 5B. And can you also note that the equalities impact assessments for the commercial portfolio are at Appendix 6B and the socio-economic business plan at 7B. So with all of that, I'm going to ask Councillor Strickland to introduce item 10.
Thank you very much, Leader. So many of the points have been covered already, but I just want to give a summary, really, of what is being proposed tonight and why I think this is important. What I think no one can deny is the desperate need in this borough for thousands of new homes of all types, and particularly affordable, for us to tackle the unacceptable levels of unemployment and child poverty by bringing growth, by bringing jobs, by bringing new businesses and making sure that existing land for employment, as Councillor Goldberg set out in the growth strategy, works much, much harder to bring jobs and brings better skilled jobs that residents are given training and support to help access. But we also know that what we consistently struggle with through the planning process is to get the right community infrastructure, to the right schools, the right health centres, the right green space. So what we've been looking at in the last couple of years is, given the huge ambitions that have come not just from councillors, but consultations in Northumberland Park, in wider Tottenham, in Wood Green and across the borough, and with council tenants and with leaseholders, the very significant work that's been going on for some years, how do we do that? So a cross-party group of members travelled around the country. We met councils who had transferred their housing to co-op housing associations, some to charitable housing associations, others had brought it back in-house. Many had done deals with, simply with private developers, others were setting up partnerships of this type and joint companies. But what was clear, Leader, is what the bulk of Labour councils we met around the country were doing was, whether it was to the private sector or to the voluntary sector, was handing over en masse their estates, their housing and other land, because they were struggling to have the skills to do stuff with that land, and they didn't have enough money to make the good quality development that they wanted. Now, having looked at that, what we decided and recommended was that Homes for Haringey would continue to manage up the bulk of our council stock, but where we wanted to do estate regeneration, where residents were supportive of estate regeneration and town centre regeneration and other change, that we needed to do something different, but we did not want to hand over all of our land to the private sector like many Labour councils had done. We wanted to maintain control, and we wanted to have a share of that profit for community facilities, and we wanted to have people at the centre of that decision making for the next 20 years to make sure that the public, what residents have told us, was protected. We didn't just hand it over and hope for the best. That's why we've been working very hard on this proposal for a joint company. Now, what's happened since we last met as a Cabinet to discuss this is an incredible amount of work by senior staff, by independent financial, legal and procurement advisors with Lend-Lease to go through the long list of requirements that we have quite rightly laid down as politicians, and as I made clear and the Leader made clear at the previous Cabinet meeting, if we could not get those guarantees for residents, we were not interested in going ahead with this company. Now, the reason this paper is before members this evening and we're having this discussion is the very long list of things that we've been seeking throughout that procurement process. We are satisfied, we are being offered, and that those guarantees are secured in the paperwork that's in front of members. So that means on homes, there will be 6,400 new homes built, of which at least 40% will be affordable, and where everybody who wants to has a right to return. That is well beyond what other Labour councils, many other Labour councils have offered, and something I feel very proud to recommend. And as Dan said earlier, that is in line with our housing strategy, which sets out tough tests on affordability, that pushes much harder on affordability than government policy does. Secondly, on jobs, we've reached a landmark proposal with Lend-Lease so that the fantastic agreement that was in place on the Olympic Park that guaranteed London living wage, that guaranteed union recognition throughout the supply chain, that guaranteed significant investment in apprenticeships and training opportunities, that world-class agreement on jobs and skills and apprenticeships reached on the Olympic Park, we will have a similar agreement in this borough. Again, that is well beyond what we have agreed with other developers in this borough on other schemes. So I'm very pleased we've got to that. The third challenge we've had is making sure, as I said earlier, that this is not just about building things, this is about making sure that existing residents get better homes, access to better jobs and get better community facilities. And that's why I'm very pleased that what's captured in these business plans is for a rebuilt library, a rebuilt school, for health facilities, for new parks, for new green space, for a people programme, for a community investment trust that will invest £20 million in the area, and for tens of millions of pounds to go into wider programmes on jobs and youth and other things. Again, that goes well beyond anything we've ever secured in this borough from a developer. And again, I feel very proud that we have got to that point, and I'm happy to recommend that to Cabinet. So I leave it there, Leader. What I will say is this has not been rushed. This has been a painstaking two-year process that scrutiny have played a very important part in, that councillors from both parties have played an important part in. There is on the table here, after long negotiation, a fantastic offer on homes, jobs and facilities, which is fundamentally about improving the life chances of our existing residents. It's about tackling inequality and it's about making a lasting difference to this borough.
Thank you, Councillor Strickland. I know that we've got questions. I'm going to take the Leader of the Opposition, Councillor Engert, first, and then I'm going to take Councillor Rice, and then Councillor Brabazon, and I'm going to start to make a note. I'll take Councillor Engert first.
Thank you, Chair. I think the Cabinet is well versed in mine and my Lib Dem group's opposition to the establishment of the proposed HDV at this juncture, given what we've learnt during the scrutiny process. However, I have 4 questions for clarification of detail. Question 1. There are many references in this report to the policy of having 40% affordable homes on HGV developments. Can you confirm that that target will be met, even if the housing market crash anticipated by the Bank of England happens? I've got references if you need them, but I think it's easier to ask the questions. Reading the papers, this is a second question. Reading the papers, it states that Lend-Lease is expected to have a 50 to 80 million margin on the first category of HGV developments, on top of the 20% management fees and other fees, with most of the profit coming from the 60% construction contracts Lend-Lease is due to get. Is that 60% of the construction contracts only for phase 1 or for all of the phases? And will Lend-Lease make a profit even if the HGV fails? My third question, on page 154, 8.17, and also page 1384, I do read papers, it states that some businesses who rent commercial units will have to start paying VAT on top of their rent. This will obviously hit small businesses the most. Given this, do you think it is fair to also be considering a service charge review, as stated on page 1369? And finally, Muswell Hill Library and Tunnel Gardens appear as potential sites for the HGV on page 773 and 837. Will these sites be going into the HGV or not? Thank you.
On your final question, I think that you're referring to Category 2 sites. There is absolutely there's no sense that they will. It's a kind of that it's phrased as they may go into the HDV. It would need to be a decision down the line. That is not a decision that we're taking this evening. We are not taking a decision to put those into the HDV. The answer to your first question I think the simplest answer to that is yes, in terms of your 40% question. The other two I'm going to turn to Councillor Strickland on. And I should also say to Cabinet members, apologies, I should have asked for your questions first. So I'm going to come to Cabinet members next and then to Councillor Rice. But Councillor Strickland, the other two questions from Councillor Hengert.
Yeah, and just to also say on the affordable that remember, if there are problems in the market, it is the joint board that will decide what to do, whether to bring other phases forward, how to do that, which is absolutely critical, and because it means that we are not on the normal situation where a developer just says the market's crashed, we're not building anything. We will be part of the decision about what to do and what to build and how. In terms of the exclusivity agreement, that does apply to all phases of the development. But it's important to say that, remember, and the reason for that is, this is a partnership with the developer. So we want them to develop things. We would not go into partnership with a developer and then say to them, but please don't build anything. So it is important that we make the most of their skills, we make the most of their expertise. That's the key reason that we're doing that. But as I mentioned earlier, nonetheless, significant independent verification of what's being proposed, of the cost, because we're very alive to the risks of developers obviously layering on extra cost, significant protections to avoid that happening. The leaders answered the question about Muswell Hill Library. Can I ask officers to answer the financial question about VAT calculations?
Yes, thank you. There may be some small effect on small businesses as a result of the VAT election. The HDV, through Lend-Lease, has committed to working with the Council to resolve that. It is likely to be phased. They have a number of options for managing that, and we'll be looking to treat that very sympathetically with businesses.
Councillor Strickland, have you completed your question? Cabinet members. Thanks, Councillor Enger. Cabinet members, questions? See Councillor Arthur first.
Thank you, Leader. So one is in reference to a few comments that have come from the public gallery in regards to the Haringey estate. I thought it might just be very helpful if you could just outline why this scheme is different to the Haringey estate. And then secondly, a lot of the concerns around us setting this up seem to be around the pace of change. And so it would be really helpful if you could outline what are we deciding tonight and what is coming after this, and at what pace do you envisage it coming?
Thank you very much. So the Haringey estate is fundamentally different for a number of reasons. The first is that what the Council did there, as I described earlier, was to do a traditional development agreement on the land, and that land was sold wholesale to a developer. That is absolutely what we're trying not to do here, hence the reason for a joint company and a partnership. Now, as I mentioned, when you hand over land like that, which has happened all over London, and there are Woodbury Down, there are other examples nearby, if a developer comes back and says, look, I'm really sorry, councillors, but I know I said 40%, but I can't do that. There's fundamentally nothing you can do about that. You can have an argument at the planning committee, but as we all know, the planning committee is right at the end of the process. So the second crucial difference with a joint company is that we're involved in that discussion, not at the very end of the process, but at the very beginning of the process. So council board members will say, right, on this site, we want this level of affordable, we want a health centre, we want this, we want that, as set out in the business plan. The third key difference is, as I mentioned earlier, we have strong and strengthening policy on right to return that makes very clear that a huge priority for us is about existing residents and existing tenants and existing leaseholders. And that right to return and that reprovision is critical to what we are trying to do. SUDC made no pretence of trying to guarantee 100% right to return. That wasn't what they were trying to do, and they're very explicit about that. So the policy intention of the Council was very different, as well as the structure being very different. In terms of the pace of change and exactly what is being decided this evening, I think that's an incredibly important point. And I wonder actually, Bernie, as the Chief Lawyer for the Council, could actually spell out very clearly to Cabinet exactly what is and is not being decided this evening.
You're essentially deciding on the commercial portfolio transfer this evening, and also an option to dispose in relation to the Wood Green sites that we own. But as pointed out in paragraph 3.7 of the report, you're not agreeing any decisions in respect of disposals or whatever in relation to Northumberland Park or Cranwood. Statutory consultation has to be carried out before any decisions are made on that, and no decisions can be made on disposals of that type at this stage.
Thanks, Bernie. Just to say, paragraph 3.7 is at page 108 of your agenda pack, if anyone wants to make quick reference to it. Any other questions from Cabinet members? Councillor Weston.
Thank you, Leader. I just wanted to ask Councillor Strickland if he could give any further information about the framework agreement, similar to the one used for the Olympic Park development site, in terms of guarantees for employment rights.
Yes, thank you very much. So there have been extensive discussions around this. There's a long list of things which are covered here, but just to summarise some of the key things. What we've sought agreement to is that we wouldn't just stick to the normal Section 106 agreements, but we would proactively seek to agree a whole raft of strategic and coherent measures that, as a package, will make a major difference in terms of young people's skills and employment. So that on the employment side, that includes guarantees around living wage and driving that down through the supply chain, which is a big challenge. That includes working hard and special programme to work with local companies, local suppliers, and to build local companies into the supply chains that will be used. On the employment side, significant guarantees around local advertising, local training, significant amounts of money to go into skills and apprenticeships, because as we know, and Councillor Goldberg has discussed passionately in this room before, it is not good enough just to create apprenticeships and create jobs. We need to make sure that residents are being skilled up to make sure that they get a good choice and they can access the different opportunities coming forward. So what I think is incredibly important is not just commitments given by Lend-Lease for their participation in this company, but also the clear commitment to drive down those commitments through the supply chain, which I think is incredibly valuable. And obviously on an ongoing basis, what I would expect is that, exactly as has happened already in some of our major regeneration areas, that new ideas will come up from tenants and leaseholders, new ideas will come up from communities, and they will be added to this programme as we go along.
Councillor Goldberg.
Thank you, Leader. I had two questions which I thought would be useful to illuminate the points. The first is there seems to be a contention that the Council is somehow incapable of negotiating with the private sector and that we should just do everything ourselves because that will somehow shield us from the market. But that aside, could you give the public a rough idea of what percentage of HAB rooms we've managed to secure for affordable and social housing in recent times in terms of our development agreements? And my second question was to the point that you were speaking about a moment ago. As you and I both know, we sat on the steering committee to look at how we kind of set up the procurement, and I was particularly passionate about the point that people who live here now have to be able to return and prosper in the communities that we are going to rebuild. And to do that, we need to do a bit more than just offer a few apprenticeships and jobs, I think, as you alluded to. Could you give an idea of the percentage that we gave to the social dividend and all the specific issues that we were concerned about outside bricks and mortar, outside housing value, outside housing numbers, but actually to improving the quantum of people's lives and the quality of people's lives? And how does that compare to other procurements of sort of similar nature?
Thank you very much, Councillor Goldberg. So, in terms of recent bits of council land, well, we have done traditional development agreements, whereas we said we've got far less control than we would with the HGV. Two big sites that are worth mentioning are Haringey Depot and also Apex House, which are both quite large, medium-sized schemes with hundreds and hundreds of new homes. On both of those, because it's our land, we were very, very clear what we wanted, and on both secured around 40% affordable housing. So I think you make a very important point, Councillor Goldberg, which is actually, even on sites with a traditional arrangement, where we've got less control and less say, we've still managed through strong negotiation to secure very significant amounts of affordable housing. And on the social dividend point, as was published in an earlier Cabinet paper, the social dividend attracted the same weighting as the other areas. And you're right to say that usually in procurement, the social point, the socio-economic point, often is completely missing from public procurement. It's not there at all. And where it is there, often it's sort of 5% to 10%. Here it was the same percentage as the other sections. So bidders were very, very clear. We care as much about the social side of this and the people side of this as we do about the others. And in terms of the scoring, it was clear to people that unless they had an excellent offer on the people side, the community side, as well as the wider side, they were simply not going to be offered the contract.
Any other questions from Cabinet members? No, not at this point. Councillor Rice, your question, please.
Thank you, Leader. Alan said earlier that the overarching consideration of this HDV project was to improve the life chances and outcomes of people within the specific areas. And I would therefore like to ask a few questions about Northumberland Park School, someone who had a long association with that school over an extended period. Now, on page 845, it says that the Council intends to prioritise local jobs and create better education opportunities. Why then is the Council supporting the academisation taking place at Northumberland Park School? What is the Council doing to ensure the stability of provision?
Councillor Rice, could you just repeat the first bit of your question? I didn't hear it.
Sorry? On page 845, it says the Council intention is to prioritise local jobs and create better education opportunities. Why then is the LEA supporting the academisation taking place at Northumberland Park School? What is the Council doing to ensure the stability of provision at Northumberland Park School when pupil intake has fallen over the last 2 years consistently? This means that the school budget is already in trouble. And what is the Council doing to encourage the growth of the school rather than the diminution of it? At 891, it implies that sixth form would be created at the new building. Is this Council intention? What is the earliest date when the new school open? What is the arrangement for PE facilities and such like when the building operation is going on and lack of facilities available? What monitoring is currently going on of the air pollution in the area as building work proceeds swiftly at the new stadium site? Yeah. That's it.
Turn your mic off. That was all your questions, Councillor Rice, yeah? OK, I'm going to turn to Councillor Weston to answer your question around the academisation and any other school issues that you can address. Councillor Strickland to mop up on the other questions.
Thank you, Councillor Rice. As you know, you made reference to your long association with the school. Any decision around academisation is a decision for the governing body of the school. And our concern is to make sure that young people who are educated at the school get absolutely the best education that they can. In terms of the reference to the sixth form on page 891, if you look at I'm not sure if you have it before you, but when it says under design, which is subparagraph 3, small 3, it does say this is an indicative master plan, and therefore there's no certain decision taken at the moment whether or not there would be a sixth form. Those decisions absolutely have not been taken, and any decisions will only be taken subject to full consultation with the school, and that is including Northumberland Park School, but also the Vale, because the commitment is to co-locate the school into any new site. The earliest date for the new school, I'm not able to give that because the Northumberland Park Master Plan has not been subject to full consultation yet, and you'd expect there to be material changes which would bring it back to the Cabinet for further consultation and decision. Air pollution, that's an issue that I believe is regulated by the planning consent that's been given to the Spurs Stadium, and I've asked officers to look into whether any issues have been raised with that, but I believe that measures were put in place to mitigate against that, but I have asked officers to contact the school already to see if they are experiencing any problems. For any of the issues that I haven't picked up, I may need to hand over to either John or colleagues, so you might need to remind us.
I think that was virtually all of the questions. John, did you need to come in at all? No. Okay. And just for reference, you talked about page 891. It's paragraph 3.4.2.1.2.3. That was the design point, just in case anyone needed that reference. Councillor Strickland, there was nothing further. Oh, was one issue for you to pick up. Thank you.
So just, Reg, your air pollution point, which is a very good one. So in terms of the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium development, which you asked about, air pollution, the effect of dust, additional lorries and traffic movement is a standard section in our construction management agreements. There is one in place for the Spurs Stadium, and probably the best thing to do is to get Emma, the Chief Planner, to write to you separately to outline exactly what's in that agreement, because that's already been signed up to with Spurs.
And I should just say, Councillor Rice, the Chief Executive was just saying to me that she met with the head teacher of Northumberland Park School last week, where they talked about any of the sort of operational issues related to large-scale building work taking place next to the school, and they've made arrangements about issues, for example, about where exams will take place, issues around sort of washing because of some of the issues with dust, etc. So that's a conversation that's live and ongoing, as you might expect. Next question I had was Councillor Bevan. If people could put their hands up, I'm just making a note, and then I'm going to move from this side to this. I've got Councillor McNamara, then Blake, and then if I don't need to put your hands up straight away, because I'm going to take those two before anyone else.
Yeah, thank you, Leader. I am a councillor in Northumberland Park, and I actually live in the ward, and I was also a member of the Housing Scrutiny Panel. As I actually live in the ward, I'm often stopped when I'm out and asked various questions about this HTV project. So one of the questions that I would like to ask, and I note that the address is showing at pages 992 to 1006 in the report. Many of those addresses I was not aware of and have never been mentioned in any briefings or reports that I've seen. So obviously that's going to come it came as a surprise to me, so it's going to come as a surprise to some residents. So can I please ask what arrangements are going to be made for consultation to begin for those particular addresses and people and tenants? And then the second question that I want to ask, over the last few months, we've agreed as councillors and as scrutiny many recommendations and suggestions to improve the current contract and reports, etc. But there's a lot of papers there. I'm having a job finding in those papers where all these changes and improvements that we've achieved are listed, so that we can ensure that they happen in the future. So I'm just wondering, would it be possible, probably not now to inform me where they all are, but afterwards someone to either highlight in the report where all these changes have been put into place, because they are of great benefit to many residents, and I would like to be able to actually show them and refer to them without any problems, basically, in future.
Sorry, I should have put my mic on. When Councillor Strickland has responded, or any other Cabinet members that need to respond to those questions, I'll take the next batch, starting with Councillor Berryman. I'm going to move from this side of the room to this side, so I won't miss anyone, but you don't need to put your hands up at the moment. It's absolutely fine. Councillor McNamara.
Thank you, Chair. I have two questions which relate to democratic oversight. Firstly, in terms of transparency, and in light of the major concerns, particularly with regards to new questions that have been arising on an almost daily basis, for example, site allocations, such as notification to Caxton Road Mosque, which I understand was told only last week that they may be a Category 1 site within the HDV, which they didn't previously know. Will meetings of the new HDV company be open to the public, and will minutes of the new HDV company be made publicly available in the way minutes of the council meetings that we have at present are publicly available, and taking into account just how much information on the HDV is not publicly available, even at this juncture, in terms of, for example, exempt papers, the yellow bundles in front of yourselves as Cabinet members that the public won't be able to read, and commercially sensitive information which has, at least in part, hindered full and in-depth scrutiny of these proposals, as I imagine members of the Overview and Scrutiny Committee will agree. So that's my first question. And the second one, further to the events at Grenfell Tower and also the reports and recommendations that emerged following the Lakenhall House fire, this now urgently raises questions for local government bodies and private companies across the UK. Can you confirm how Haringey Council has had time to fully explore the implications for this vital area of work in relation to the risk assessments of the HTV, and particularly in light of the letter issued this morning by both of Haringey's Members of Parliament that raises significant concerns about this?
Councillor Strickland.
Thank you very much. Right, so John, in terms of your first question on land and sites in Northumberland Park, it is really important to say that the land that's got a red line around it that could be developed by the HGV is the same as in the site allocation document, which was subject to repeated public consultation, and in the Tottenham Area Action Plan, which again was subject to repeated public consultation. The Area Action Plan was agreed by Cabinet. It highlights the Northumberland Park estate and says that the Council's view following consultation is there should be significant regeneration on that estate. So I think it's not really fair to say that this has come out of the blue. The sites in this document draw on sites that have been extensively consulted on through the normal planning process and which have been approved by an independent, a government external planning inspector. In terms of scrutiny, I think the first thing to say is that the report does make clear that most recommendations are agreed or partially agreed. The report that we agreed just now does summarise the Cabinet's response and what's been changed. But if you're keen to sort of understand in more detail, I'm sure Dan or an officer would happily meet you to talk about those documents. Councillor McNamara, in terms of new information, as I say, things in terms of sites, that was in the site allocations document, it was consulted on, and the Wood Green and Tottenham regeneration sites are covered by the two area action plans, which are obviously subject to the Northumberland Park one is done, Wood Green one is being further consulted on at the moment. So, as I said earlier, there have been significant things in the public domain about this. In terms of Grenfell Tower, you're absolutely right that I would expect there would be significant implications for developments, not just in the public sector, but across the sectors and for our regulatory role as a planning authority. But as I mentioned earlier, nothing will be built by the HGV for some time. We would expect that by that point, absolutely, the government inquiry would have reported. You would hope that there would be very clear recommendations for policy change or building regulation change. The letter from the MPs asked if the Council would abide by changes to building regulations, and of course the answer is one, of course we would, because we are determined to guarantee better fire safety. But the second point to make is we are legally obliged to, so there is no question of the Council ignoring any change in building regulation, nor would we ever want to.
Sorry, I'm just going to bring in Dan. Sorry, if you just hold on a moment, Councillor McNamara.
So on the access to the board meetings and minutes of the HTV, so the HTV is not a local government body, so it's not subject to the same rules that council meetings are. And I think although the final arrangements for the kind of transparency arrangements associated with the board meeting haven't been set, I think the presumption is that the meetings would not be held in public, but there would be a clear commitment to publish information about the business done at those meetings.
I'm going to just turn to the Chief Executive to update on Grenfell and the fire issue that you raised, as I know that she was speaking to officials over the weekend. Councillor Blake, I should have taken your question also at the same time, but I'm going to come back to that. Councillor McNamara, I will give you an opportunity for clarification, but then we're going to move on because I've got a number of questions to take. Chief Executive.
So just in response to the kind of learning lessons from Grenfell as quickly as possible, I understand there have been commitments in the House of Parliament to make interim findings from any public inquiry public as soon as possible so that councils and others are able to learn the lessons as quickly as possible. But more swiftly than that, I was speaking to very senior officials at the Department of Communities and Local Government on Saturday evening to urge them to tell us as quickly as possible what the learnings that were going on with the technical panels that have been put together to look at any changes in building regulations that need to happen. They have a technical assessment panel already in place, and they have committed to provide us with the findings from that as quickly as possible, and indeed some findings from that have already been coming out to building regulations officers throughout local government.
Councillor Bevan, it really needs to be very brief because I'm not going to give all councillors the opportunity for follow-up supplementary questions. So very briefly, then Councillor McNamara, then Councillor Blake, and then we'll get responses and turn to the next round.
Right. Almond Road is listed in those addresses. It's never been mentioned before. It's private street properties and it's never had any consultation. And the recommendations I was referring to were not only scrutinies, but the agreements that have been made with councillors about improvements.
Councillor Bevan, I know you're referring to the commercial property portfolio. If you could give us a page reference, that would be helpful. Councillor McNamara, your clarification?
Yeah, I think that list is page 992 onwards, just in case. But the clarification, look, I'm grateful to Councillor Strickland and to officers, including the Interim Chief Executive, for answering those points. I think the point here is that it's about clarification around the assurances to be given in terms of transparency, that with the status quo and public meetings of the council being subject to rules around minutes having to be published and meetings having to be held in public, if at this juncture so much information is not publicly available, then it does raise a massive question as to what situation residents, leaseholders and traders will face under a private HDV company. That's simply the point that I was raising with regards to.
Councillor Blake.
Thank you, Chair. My question is about equality's impact. The EQIAs in these papers for both Northumberland Park and Wood Green give detailed demographic analysis of the areas and the communities where land is targeted for transfer and where homes are proposed for demolition. Whilst this equalities information is welcome, I've been unable to find any information within these EQIAs where any professional analysis is set out regarding what the actual impact may be of the HDV and proposed changes, such as home demolitions on target communities. How does this approach comply with the guidance from the Equality and Human Rights Commission that stipulates that full EQIA work assessments should include details of the mitigation that needs to be taken to be completed before key decisions are made, which I believe case law supports? Where is the EQIA pointing out how these new policies will not discriminate against and adversely impact on these different target groups, and how discrimination will be avoided against these groups? What evidence is there that the dynamics of the HDV will not exacerbate discrimination against target groups? Thank you.
I'm going to ask Councillor Strickland, and then if Dan wanted to come in, and then Erica, if you wanted to come in also.
Thank you very much. So, Councillor Bevan, if you've got a particular site in your ward you want us to have a look at, probably best if we do that outside of this meeting. Secondly, Councillor McNamara, I completely take your point in terms of transparency. And as I mentioned earlier, the reason for publishing all of this when other councils have not is absolutely, to start, as we mean to go on and try and be as transparent as possible. It's important to say that under the conventional development agreement model that councils use, because there's a private contractor there owning the land and doing the work, councillors have very, very limited access indeed to any commercial information. Whereas under the HGV approach, there will be 3 board members from the council who will be privy to all of that information, and decisions will be taken jointly on that basis. So there's a separate question about to what extent some of that commercial information can be published on websites, and that will be something that's important to look at. But it is important to stress that senior members of this council will have access to all of that information, because they will be a member of the board that's being reported to and is scrutinising what's happening. In terms of the equalities impact assessment, I'll start, and officers may want to jump in. what is covered on page 161 at point 454 is in the equalities section. It does talk about, it summarises the equalities impact work done so far, but as Bernie said, because tonight Cabinet is not making a number of housing decisions, that has to be subject to statutory consultation, and of course we want to talk to those residents in any case, regardless of our statutory obligations. The report does make clear that, and I quote, "In addition, as expressly noted in the EQIAs for both Northumberland Park and Cranwood, the decision that Cabinet is being asked to take do not include decisions to dispose of either site. As, when and if Cabinet is asked to consider such decisions, further detailed equalities impact assessments will necessarily be prepared for Cabinet." So the report does set out quite clearly, Leader, that there isn't a full suite of equalities impact assessments set out for all the decisions into the future, because Cabinet is not making all of those decisions this evening.
Dan or Erica, anything to add? Dan?
I guess the only thing I'd add is that the equality impact assessments that accompany this report were prepared in all cases jointly by the officers in the teams who are working specifically on the areas of the borough which are in question in those business plans, alongside the kind of in-house professional expertise that we have on equality. So in all cases, professional expertise has been applied. We've also had legal advice, including external legal advice, which has confirmed that the way that these have been carried out, both the way that they've been developed and then the way they've been finalised and published, is consistent with the Council's public sector equality duty.
Okay, thanks for that. Thank you, Councillors Bevan, McNamara and Blake. Councillors Berriman, Adjei and Opoku, do you have questions, all three of you? Or Berriman, if you want to come forward. The other two of you, I'm presuming you don't, or you do? You haven't. Okay, so I'm going to move along. So then I've got Stennett and Tucker. So Berriman, Stennett, Tucker, if you want to all sit down, and we'll do the same. We'll take all of your questions and then we'll ensure that you get responses. Great. Councillor Berriman.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Strickland said earlier that no one can deny the need for thousands of new homes of all types. I'm not going to outright deny that, but I think there's an argument to be made in certain types, for example, luxury flats in London, where prices fell last year, which is normally a sign of supply exceeding demand, that there may not be a need for thousands of all types of homes. There is almost certainly a need for a certain type of home, such as social housing. We have a long waiting list for this in our borough, and I haven't heard a strong case that the HDV will be increasing the numbers of social homes, but that's just a side point. My two questions relate to the business case around the HDV. We all know the last time the Cabinet approved Lend-Lease in February, we all know that a lot has changed since then. And that's since February, let alone 2015, when the substantive business case was done. For example, in January 17, the leader sent an open letter to Haringey residents outlining the business case for the HD, and, for example, referred to the HDV taking full advantage of improvements like Crossrail. Now, it seems at the moment Crossrail is not on the agenda for this government, a hung parliament, a coalition government now. It wasn't in the Queen's speech or the Tory manifesto. Likewise, we have now, as a country, triggered Article 50. We do, as I say, had a hung parliament in the election, and, of course, tragically, the Grenfell Tower disaster. In the light of this and the shifting in public opinion, could you please restate what the financial penalty would be of a pause at this point? And I don't want a reputational or hypothetical thing. I want just to know the financial penalty for Haringey to pause at this point. And the reason I ask that is that the climate has changed since February, public opinion has changed, and perhaps we should, as a council, reassess these risks and try and build consensus. We've got the latest letter from the MPs who are urging this. What prevents us from doing this? So what's the financial penalty? What prevents us from a pause now? Because I would argue a bad deal is not better than no deal at this point.
Councillor Stennett. Councillor Stennett.
Right, so the first question is about get-out clauses, termination, associated costs. I know that a number of councillors were persuaded by the assertion that the council could sign this HDV agreement but then withdraw from it if external circumstances change at minimum cost, a sort of no-fault divorce. The proposed agreement addresses termination as section 27, page 169 of the report. 27.14, clause 27.14 shows that the only way that the council can initiate the ending of the HDV agreement is with the written agreement of Lend-Lease. The question is, won't they demand a premium to sign that agreement? Isn't it thus true that once this deal is signed, Haringey Council is married to Lend-Lease for 20 years because we could not afford the price of separation? And then the second question is about commercial property. The report talks about corporate property, particularly in regard to Wood Green. I refer to section 36 on page 1355 of the report. The report talks about disposing of commercial assets and avoiding negative publicity from doing so. Why should selling council property be a priority for the HDV? Furthermore, on the following page at section 3.7, when talking about acquisitions, the stated policy is to purchase property through shadow companies that hide the fact that the HDV is the actual buyer in order to pay less money for it. Do you think it is fair to blight people's homes and businesses and then possibly not even pay them a fair price when buying them out?
May I refer to page 108 of the appendices? There is a concern, which you will have gathered that I share, that in terms of the assurances of re-provision of social housing, there may be less to these than meets the eye. I'm extremely worried that there is not just one route, but a number of routes by which, through the HDV, and including in the wording which we're being presented with today, there are ways by which Lend-Lease may find their way to a very, very substantial reduction in the amount of council housing available in the borough. May I ask regarding two issues around the right of return? 5.41, it is agreed that HDV business plans prioritise a single move for residents rather than right of return. Is what we're talking about then a paper right of return, but in actual practical terms, when the flats come to be demolished, that residents will be persuaded, cajoled, induced to stay where they've gone rather than returning to the estate? And I come then to 5.4.3. Commit to the re-provision of residential property calculated by reference to number of habitable rooms rather than occupants. And I've already referred to the fact that that will inevitably mean a reduction in the number of council equivalent flats in the borough. Coming on to the second sentence, the council is committed to right of return and if needed will work with the HDV in this regard, recognising that this might involve a requirement for additional subsidy. If there is going to be a substantial re-provision within the new estates of social rented flats, why would there be any need for an additional subsidy to accommodate people wanting to return to their estate? May I move on to the issue which I raised earlier and which is also addressed on this page, which is about timing of the calculation of the number of social flats which are going to be provided. Alan, in his answer earlier on, mentioned that this would come at planning stage. One of the problems with this is that because the consultation and engagement would already have started, and we already have a situation in which it's likely that, for instance, normal maintenance would be suspended and there wouldn't be building work as normal construction work to maintain the standard of the properties during the process. and for many other reasons, that existing secure tenants would be gradually leaving the estates, resulting in a situation where by the time you actually had planning permission, you had a very, very substantial reduction in the number of tenancies. Therefore, I ask, are, for instance, empty flats at that time and flats occupied by people in temporary accommodation going to be counted into that number of homes that need to be re-provided in the new flat? Because otherwise we will very, very likely end up with another route beyond the issue of viability, which I already raised, by which Lend-Lease is going to have not one, not two, not three, but four, or perhaps undreamt of ways of reducing the number of social homes which are provided in the borough via the HDV.
Okay, let me address briefly, Councillor Berryman, your point around Crossrail. I think there are just two things to say on this. The first is that in terms of Crossrail 2, the National Infrastructure Commission report last week committed to Crossrail 2 as a priority project, and indeed the strategic outline business case that has been presented to government is proposing a single station at Wood Green. The second thing to say, however, is if your issue around Crossrail 2 doesn't go ahead, in terms of the PTAL levels, the public transport accessibility levels that are achieved in Wood Green, those levels are achieved through the upgrading of the Piccadilly line, which is on track for the mid-2020s, is already funded and will increase, and I met with the Managing Director of TfL last week, will increase capacity on the Piccadilly line by 60%, 30% through improved frequency of the service and 30% through new rolling stock. So just to address that very briefly. And then, Councillor Tucker, your point around the right of return and a single move seems to suggest that these two policies are inherently at odds with each other, and I'd suggest to you that it's perfectly possible to be committed to both. So just to give you a live example of that, on the Northumberland Park estate, if residents wish to exercise their right of return, we would want to facilitate that. That estate regeneration scheme would necessarily need to come through in phases. So the idea would be that you move people on that estate just once, they remain on the estate, but because they're remaining on the estate, they have both moved only once and they have exercised their right of return. In other cases, we will absolutely facilitate what people want. I can imagine scenarios where older residents may say to us, look, I want to move just once. I'm happy to move in the borough but to a different place to where I'm currently residing. I'm happy to live in Wood Green, for example, rather than North Tottenham. And others will say to us, bottom line, I might need to move twice, but I want my right of return. So it's perfectly possible that all of those scenarios can be met. And I think the really important thing to recognise here is that a one-size-fits-all approach will not work, that we need to work with individual residents, and that's why the sort of painstaking work that's being undertaken already on estates and has been undertaken for several years through the independent tenants and leaseholders advisors and the work of our officers will need to continue to ensure that we get that right. Councillor Strickland, other points.
Thank you, Leader. So, Councillor Berryman, your two questions. So, you raised an issue around demand for housing. What the Council's strategic housing market assessment does show, and this is common to many London boroughs, there genuinely is not enough housing of any type. Which is why across London rents are spiralling upwards, as Reverend Nicholson said quite rightly earlier, house prices are going upwards, and we know from our waiting list, as you said quite rightly, that we haven't got enough affordable housing either. So there is huge pressure on every single type of home, and that's why the housing strategy does commit us to building a mix of different types of property, and that's what the HDV would do as well. But as I said earlier, securing 40% affordable goes well above the London average for affordability on development, so a big priority for us clearly here is affordable housing. In terms of your question on if the Council pauses, is there a direct financial penalty for that? The answer is no, but as you said quite in your question, the question for Cabinet tonight is, are we satisfied that, given the criteria, very stringent criteria we set out some time ago for what we wanted, given the discussions that have happened in more detail with Lend-Lease, and given what the package that's in front of us this evening, do we think this gives us what we want, and does this fulfil the ambitions that residents have set out? And my recommendation is that it does, and that's the key thing we're looking at here. I'll get Dan to answer your questions and in terms of termination and shadow companies and the legal side of things. But Councillor Tucker, coming to your other questions, I think what it is worth saying is that I think a lot of your questions started with when Lend-Lease make a decision on. And as I've said before, Lend-Lease alone will not make a decision on any of this. Decisions can only be taken in accordance with the business plan that's agreed by this Cabinet, and decisions within the business plan, day-to-day operation, can only be taken by the board, of which the Council is 50%. And because it's 50-50, we can block anything we don't like. So it is not the case that Lend-Lease will be unilaterally deciding things and then coming to planning or coming to the Cabinet. That's not how it works at all. The leader sets out very clearly the single move issue. And then in terms of habitable rooms, this came up at the cross-member briefing, which I think you were at a little while ago, and what the Director of Regeneration and the Assistant Director of Regeneration made very clear is that the right to return trumps the habitable room policy, but also what was said there, and I'll say again, is that looking at things on a habitable room basis can be very, very important, because what we do not want to do, if you went down a purist route of just re-provide what you've got, then we would say to an overcrowded family in a one-bed flat, well, you've got a one-bed, you're getting a one-bed. That's your lot. That's obviously completely unacceptable. So one of the reasons the policy does talk about habitable rooms is because what will happen on literally a door-by-door, family-by-family basis, if this goes ahead, is an individual assessment of who's living here, what are your needs, are you overcrowded, do you need in a new flat, for example, disabled adaptations. So for some families, they will get a new flat, but it will necessarily be bigger. And that's why we talk about habitable rooms, making sure that as a minimum, the amount of space in a development for affordable is the same, but the room configuration might be different given what tenants genuinely need. And then, Dan, can I ask you to pick up Councillor Stennett's questions on termination questions, and then this question around the sort of calculations you've been doing on affordable?
So you referred, Councillor Stennett, I think, to Section 27 of the Members' Agreement, what you described, the situation where on a termination both sides would have to agree to the termination. So that describes one of the scenarios where the HDV is terminated, which is a so-called voluntary termination. There are other scenarios, for example, if either party defaults on the agreement, but also if there's a deadlock. So if the HDV board can't agree on something and that can't be settled by escalation, then that also gives rise to a different kind of termination scenario. So that situation you described, you picked out from Section 27, is only one of the scenarios where the HDV might wind up. On the question about the kind of calculation of habitable rooms, so I guess the first thing to say is it certainly isn't the case that we would suspend the normal maintenance regime on any estate identified for estate renewal. For as long as there are people living in those flats, whether they are leaseholders or tenants or people in temporary accommodation, we would of course continue to maintain the flats and the estate to the standards that we've set for ourselves. But to answer the specific question, if as we got closer to the point where the site was fully vacated, there were empty flats or flats being used as temporary accommodation, they would still count as council flats for the purposes of calculating the reprovision. So there's no question as to whether the number would erode in that way. Councillor Senate, did we answer the question about the commercial portfolio? Was that the other set of questions you asked? Sorry, I can't hear.
I understand there are other scenarios when, the relationship can be terminated, but can you specifically refer to what I've asked, the question I've asked about 27.1.4? What happens with that?
Yes, so as I said, that applies specifically to the case where both parties agree that they want to wind it up, and in that case, as that suggests, that both parties have to agree in writing that that is what they wish. But as I say, that's only one of the scenarios where the HDV...
In all of those termination scenarios, the Council has the right to acquire back property assets. In a voluntary scenario, that would be at market value. In other circumstances, there are different rights in favour of the Council.
Okay, thank you for those questions. I'm now looking at Councillor Bull. Sorry, I've taken your questions. We're not, as I said last time around, Councillor Berryman, we're not having further rounds of questions. No, I'm really sorry. I've got loads of people behind with their hands up. Councillor Bull, Councillor Newton, did you have a question before I move to the other side of the room? No. Councillor Bull, Councillor Carter, Councillor Connor, did you have your hand up? Yeah, and then I'll come to you next, round Councillor Brabazon.
Oh, by gum, it's hot. Right, OK, I've got just a couple of questions. Firstly, on right to buy as leaseholders, and I'll place on record the fact I'm a leaseholder, so I've got some genuine concerns about this. And my concern relates to page 108, paragraph 5.4.6. And it's this: right to buy leaseholders will be offered a shared equity product if they wish to return to their neighbourhood. Have the implications of this been discussed with affected leaseholders, especially since this proposal may limit their ability to have the same level of ownership of a property in the area as before? And has it been considered that they may be plunged into debt given the pricing of the new properties and the fact that there is additional service charges as set out in the delivery plan within the appendices? That's the first question. The second question relates predominantly to decent homes programmes for Northumberland Park, and residents across the ward boundary have been in touch with both myself and councillors in Northumberland Park concerning the decent homes programme and the fact that some of that's been halted and paused. I suspect I know the answer as to why it's happened, but I'd like you to place on record why it's happened. And the third question, my penultimate question, relates to February 28th Homes for Haringey board meeting, specifically under the asset management plan, and it says the following: the following stock is not included in the 2017-18 proposal. Specifically, it says stock which has been identified for potential regeneration or inclusion in Haringey Council's new joint venture, i.e. the Haringey Development Vehicle. Can you say what that is? And finally, a general question. In the 16 years or so that I've been on this council has had its fair share of really tough times and controversial decisions and such like, some of its own making, a lot of it not of its making. Out there, Councillor Strickland, there is real fear, Councillor Coe, there's real fear out there about this and the lack of information, or perhaps too much information which doesn't address the concerns of residents. Now, given that there are so many people living in this borough who must have specialist knowledge around housing, not just within the Labour movement, but far outside of that, I don't feel we've done enough to engage with those specialist knowledges. Can you tonight give an assurance to residents that you will up the game of this council in terms of addressing their concerns and engage with them to ensure that they understand that politics is about taking tough decisions, and politics is about making their lives better? And do you think that this will make their lives better? Thank you.
Councillor Carter.
Thank you, Chair. I have two questions. The first is in connection with the external auditor. When the auditor was making his plan, he identified the HDV as an area of, I think, significant risk. The first question is, has the external auditor published or finished his report? That's the first question. The second is a broader question. Councillor Goldberg earlier referred to the capacity of the council to negotiate with a huge developer. He said that we've got a great ability to do that. I detect a little bit of contradiction here with, I think you, Chair, have said in the past that we don't have the ability to develop these sites ourselves. So there's a little bit of tension there, I think, between those two viewpoints. Could that be commented on, please?
Just one question, really, and this is about scrutiny. So, of course, I'm really interested in, if this goes ahead, how will scrutiny function? I understand that there would be a member of the Cabinet on the HDV and there would be oversight from officers, but obviously we are used to, as a council, especially as the backbenchers, scrutinising this, and I think the concern was that the meetings wouldn't be in public, so it would be difficult to see how, especially when the work programme, I noted that that wasn't available for scrutiny to look at. It would just be really useful to get some clarity for members of the public to understand how it's going to be open and transparent going forward regarding scrutiny. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Connor. I don't see any conflict, Councillor Carter, between myself and Councillor Goldberg, but Councillor Goldberg may wish to say something further, but let me first address your point around the external auditors. So the external auditors have today written to the Council to say we've nearly finished our initial review of the proposed decision to create the Haringey Development Vehicle. The scope of the review has focused on, has due process been followed? Secondly, are there any indications that the process will deliver poor value for money to the Council and its residents? And thirdly, have the Council's interests been adequately protected? This letter just sets out the preliminary findings, but let me take you to the conclusion, which is titled the initial conclusion. It says, based on our initial review, we are satisfied that the Council has undertaken sufficient work and provided appropriate information to Cabinet to allow it to make a reasonable decision whether to proceed with the Haringey Development Vehicle. We have not raised any concerns that need to be brought to the attention of Cabinet ahead of the meeting on the 3rd of July. We agree that you may share this preliminary findings letter with the Cabinet. Councillor Goldberg, I'll bring you in now, and then Councillor Strickland.
Thank you, Leader. I think it's not quite true to say that we're never in conflict, but this is not one of those issues, I'm glad to say. And perhaps, Councillor Carter, just clarify what I did say, because I understand it's easy to mishear people in this room, and in other rooms indeed. What I said was, I'm quite surprised that the argument against the HDV is that the public sector has no capacity to negotiate with the private sector. And I used the case of negotiating on development sites that we've already done as an example. Well, I think the point the leader's making, which is about the capacity around building and the expertise around the physical development, where we have lost that capacity, mainly because of the decisions made by the Tory government, and actually most recently in 2010, where public housing is becoming significantly unviable. Something I would add that your party did absolutely nothing to address while it was in coalition. In fact, it made the regime more punitive in terms of us being able to have capacity to build housing. It made it more punitive in terms of the ability to use right-to-buy receipts, and it made it more punitive in terms of the level of discounts it gave to people at right-to-buy, which is one of the reasons why I think actually the de facto capacity and the physical and financial viability of us to also develop is better served by the vehicle that's been proposed tonight than it is by public housing going ahead alone.
Thanks, Councillor Goldberg, but you did miss the slashing of social housing grant and the moving of that grant from being a capital-based grant to a revenue-based subsidy, which of course heralded the introduction of the affordable rent model. Councillor Strickland.
Thank you, Leader. So, Councillor Connor, your question on scrutiny, how that would work. So it's important to say that there will still be multiple opportunities for scrutiny. Members of HTV staff, like people from the NHS, the police and other people can be invited to scrutiny for that, to discuss what they're doing. But equally, if councillors feel that the council is not getting what it set out to achieve, and we're not getting our side of the bargain, as it were, then scrutiny, as normal, can call me and the leader and say, what on earth are you doing? You told us we were going to get this, we're not. So you can both scrutinise the HGV staff who can come along, but you can also remember scrutinise the senior politicians who will be overseeing the relationship with the HGV. So there'll be multiple opportunities for scrutiny to continue. Councillor Bull, in terms of your shared equity question, so this is something that's covered in our revised rehousing policy, which is being consulted on at the moment. And as I mentioned at Cabinet on the 20th of June, what's set out for leaseholders, including this offer around shared equity, so you can move the value of your property into a new property, goes beyond our statutory obligations. It goes beyond what many other councils offer, and is an important part of us genuinely trying to make sure that leaseholders do get a fair deal. That's very important to us. In terms of decent homes work, as Dan said, I've actually been criticised in this Cabinet before by deputies for spending money on blocks that might be regenerated in the future. So we will, where regeneration is some way off, we will continue to do decent homes, and in any case we continue to do normal repairs as tenants report them. What has happened with some properties that might be in an early phase of the HGV is that things have been paused pending a decision by Cabinet. Of course, further decisions on Decent Homes programme will be made following decisions on the development vehicle. I think that's all of the questions, Leader.
Leader,
Okay,
I fear that
sorry,
he's
Bull,
inadvertently misinformed. He's inadvertently. Hang on,
Councillor
sorry,
Bull,
Claire.
no, I'm sorry, I'm chairing
well,
the meeting.
okay,
Councillor
but he's
Bull.
inadvertently
I'm really happy,
misled the council by what he's just said. Would you like him to correct the record or not?
I'd like you to pick your question up outside of the meeting. As I've said, we've got other questions to
Okay.
have, so we'll pick
That's
that
your
up
choice.
outside. Okay. Next round, Councillor. I'm just trying to see Councillor Brabazon. Councillor Morris, do you have a question? No. Okay. So I've got Councillor Brabazon, Councillor Ibrahim, Councillor Diakides. Ask them all in a bundle, please.
I will.
Thanks.
I will. Right. I'd like to return to the issue of the properties on page 992 of the bundle. Prior to that, you might want to look at page 985. I think it's at 985. I'm assuming you've all read this, so this won't be news to you. Page 985 of this bundle has a map. I don't have this in colour, but as you say, Alan, this map is a red line. You said yourself, in case Councillor Burke can correct me, you did say that the red line is around there, and in the map, in colour, that's what it is. That's what it has on the internet. Now, there is a meaning to red line, which you might have looked up yourself in Wikipedia, which is redlining is a historic term, which means you draw a red line round an area to disinvest. That's what it actually means, and it was coined in America in poor neighbourhoods. Now, I say that because if you then turn to page 986 of the bundle, you will find that there's a table, and obviously the public don't have this table, Chair, so I'm going to take the liberty of reading it out. And it says here that there are 649 private freehold units in that map. Of those, the plan is to demolish 252 private freehold homes. Demolish. Demolish 276 private leasehold units, and then to demolish 889 council rental units. That is a total number of 1,417, but of course you'll know that because this is your papers and the HDV business plan. That demolition is 71% of the existing homes in that red-lined area. So my question to you is, if you turn to page 992, where you'll have the list, and that list is not, Councillor Cober, of commercial properties. These are residential properties. And they are in this listed addresses, presumably because there has been a title search with the land registry. These are people's homes, freeholds and leaseholds. So my question to you, if I could just written it down, sorry, excuse me, I've written it down, so I'll read it out. My question to you is, these roads are privately owned, these homes are privately owned, they are listed, I presume this list is about demolition, perhaps you can confirm that. And my question is, what consultation have you had with the affected owners of these properties, which are listed on page 992 to 1006, prior to this report and plan being made public? Have you discussed them with the residents and the owners and the landlords and leaseholders with the I'll wait till Helen has stopped. Have you discussed with these people, the 250 properties or so that are slated, I'm assuming, for demolition, because that's what the report says, have you discussed with them the implications for these people regarding their homes and their futures, and how this might affect them getting loans, mortgages for improvement, any mortgage of any kind, or funding for any type of improvements to their homes? Have you discussed with them the impact of redlining that area and the blight and potential CPO which might occur if I've read these documents correctly? In summary, Do they know about this? And if so, can copies of the letters or newsletters which they must have been given be made public? Thank you. That's my first question. Right. That's my first question. And I am surprised that is listed in these documents. Perhaps it was a mistake, supposed to be redacted, but it's in the public documentation. Title about people's homes, individual people's homes. Right. My next question is related to the Future of Housing Review. Now, you and I have discussed this on many occasions, and I did ask a member inquiry, as you know, about the Future of Housing Review, and I wanted to know about the background documentation attached to that. Now, I did get a very helpful reply from the officers, and it included a document from Pricewaterhouse dated November 2013. Now, that document, I'm assuming you've read, preceded the Turnberry documents, which promoted the overarching vehicle beyond all others, with lots of pros for overarching and not very many cons. Now, the Pricewaterhouse document, which I have read, suggests the opposite. It was much more nuanced, much more guarded in its analysis, and in fact seemed to me, when I read it, to support a wholly owned vehicle. And the reasons that were given in that were to do with the council retaining control. That's what it said, that the council would retain control, and it would provide scope for more differentiated and customised approaches for housing development, including setting up small joint ventures. They didn't discount that, they just took a different view, and they were concerned about the risk of an overarching vehicle. So my question is, if Pricewaterhouse recommended this in 2013, how come what happened to the report? What's happened to it? It's never been discussed, and so on, and why suddenly a different set of reports appeared. So perhaps you could answer that, especially since they underpinned the Future Housing Review on which you rely for the HDV. Sorry? And it was certainly never mentioned in our scrutiny. We never heard about it. My third question, is the right of return. Now, can I ask you to go to the leaseholder agreement on page 108? I've just sorted my bundles out. Hang on. My first question is, what trumps what? Does the member agreement trump the council's policy, or does the council's policy trump the member agreement, since they say different things? In page 108, paragraph... Sorry, excuse me, I'm sorry for taking your time here. Paragraph 5... hang on. Sorry, I'm looking at the wrong agreement. Beg your pardon. Let me go to it. Here it is. Sorry, got it here. Page 108. Here we are. Sorry, beg your pardon. On page 108, at paragraph 5.5, it says, it is agreed that once the final version of the estate renewal policy thing has been adopted by the council, the parties will review the adopted policy. If there are no material changes, the HDV will comply with the ERPRP, which is the estate renewal, can't remember what it all stands for, programme, so adopted. But then it says, subject to the exclusions set out as paragraph 5.4 above. Now, paragraph 5.4 talks about prioritising the single move for residents rather than right of return, talks about not allowing for the rehousing of housing association tenants except by the council paying, and it also says at 5.4.4, which is I would like an answer on this, provides for rehousing within the category 1 properties and does not provide for rehousing across the borough outside of the category 1 properties, which is a matter for the council. This applies to tenants, resident leaseholders and resident freeholders. So does this mean that all these rights of return only apply to people, even if they are real, because my question is what trumps what, does this only apply to people who live in Northumberland Park? Because what about the tenants on Broadwater Farm? And what about the tenants in Tunnel Gardens? And what about the tenants on Imperial Wharf, who are in Category 2? This document says it doesn't apply. So can you are going to vote on this tonight. It is important that you tell us what this means and what trumps what and what the policy is. Because I don't understand what this actually means. And this member agreement is here in the public domain. I've read it. I think I'm entitled to, and in fact the whole public are entitled to a proper response on what is the position, because it is entirely, in my view, I'm not a lawyer, but in my view, entirely unclear. My final question relates to Northumberland Park Community School. In the documentation, and I regret that I haven't got the page reference, but I will do a search and I'll send it to you, it says in terms that the plan, the master plan, it does say it's going to go to the eastern part of the estate. That's what it says about the school. On the eastern part of the estate, if the detail is right, that you intend to knock down Robert Burns House, Haynes Close and Charles Bradlaugh House, and that will be the site. That's the master plan site. That's what it says in the small print of this documentation. Why don't you just say, first of all, why don't you just say it and say that's what you're proposing, if that's what you're proposing. Number two, these are, I point out to you in public, these are low-rise, uncladded maisonettes and family homes, nicely landscaped. Where are these people going to go? Is it that they're going to be put on the sports pitches of Northumberland Park School, which is what the documentation suggests, in which case, where are the kids going to do their sport? And where, if you build this school, is the sport provision going to go? Where are these families going to go? How can it be right to demolish decent family homes at a time when homes are at such a premium for what might, and that we are going to put 18 million of our own money into this? Is it, and I ask the final question, it does worry me because of the proximity to the stadium. Thank you.
Councillor Ibrahim. No, we're doing it the same way that we've gone with everyone. So we're going to take you, and then I'm going to tell Councillor Dykes and then get answers.
Thank you. So I've got a number of questions. The first one actually is something that I asked in my original presentation on the scrutiny report, which you may have overlooked, Alan, to answer, but it's again on exclusivity. So I suppose what my question is, what are the advantages of exclusivity, particularly at 60%? Does this not mean that essentially Lend-Lease start making a profit from day one? So we can clearly see what the advantages are for them, because obviously they'll be making a profit on the work that they will be getting as a result of that 60% exclusivity. They're not going to do it on cost. So the advantages for them are clear, but what are the advantages for us? My second question is, and I'd really like to be enlightened on this because I came across it in the document and I was slightly confused. Can you explain what horizontal and vertical exclusivity means? Because I certainly haven't understood it. And my third question is on consultation. So there's been a commitment to do consultation and to fully consult with residents, etc. If I give you a scenario, which I'm hoping you can answer, say, for example, a year down the line, you do a full consultation and the residents of Northumberland Park, or, for example, the residents of Broadwater Farm say, no, we don't like this, we don't want to do this, we don't want the council to do this, we don't... obviously, I know you've rejected the recommendation on a full ballot, but a consultation can be done properly where you can have a genuine conversation. It's not a fait accompli, it's a genuine dialogue. If that was the response you got, considering these sites have been identified in the specification and within the agreement, and it's part of what went through the OG process, what would be the cost of that for us if we then decided to take those sites out? So would Lend-Lease not then be able to turn around and say to us, well, hold on a minute, we've just signed up to an agreement with you and now you're taking a substantial part of this out, would there be any financial... we know that up until today there are no financial implications, but if you sign on the dotted line after today and you get a response which is negative, what are the financial implications of that? So that's my third question. And again, I suppose you could roll this into one. Say, for example, in a year's time, hopefully, and I'm sure all of us, bar a few perhaps, in this room would want to see a Labour government in a year. If that did happen and we did get the funding and we could do something like this alone and we decided we wanted to do that, what would be the cost of extricating ourselves from this after today? And again, I'll combine my last question into the same one. So if I refer you to page, now this is a sentence in and of itself, 1423. Okay, you've got, it's the socio-economic strategy. And it refers to 22,000 new jobs. Where are those jobs coming from? What are they? What types of jobs? What modelling have you done to be able to predict that? Because that's a very high number. Is it the construction jobs that as a result of this? Is it going to be some kind of, economic boost? Is there going to be a huge multinational company coming and basing itself in the borough? That's a lot of jobs, and I'd want to know on what basis that calculation. So are they long-term jobs, for example? Are they sustainable jobs? Because it's a very round figure. Also, on the same page, it refers to 5,000 new homes. Now, I've seen a figure of 6,400 elsewhere. Which one is correct?
So, Ibrahim, Councillor Diakidis, your questions?
Oh, sorry.
All right. I won't cover anything that others have covered, just a couple of very general questions. As councillors, we have a legal duty, it's called fiduciary duty, a kind of a need to exercise due diligence on anything that might be risky. That is an individual duty, not separate from any collective duty as members of particular parties or whatever majority decisions have been made. Now, within that context, I and my fellow councillors, until this week when these papers were published, we had not seen access to any written report on this subject beyond verbal presentations, occasionally with some PowerPoints. The only ones we have seen significantly are two reports from the Scrutiny Committee, which both of them raise the issues of significant risks and both of them asking for deferral of decision. In this context, my first question is, could the Borough Solicitor, on record here, assure me and my fellow councillors that we are safe in terms of this particular issue, that we're not going to be accused of dereliction of our fiduciary duty as individuals, as individual councillors, in the case of any forthcoming legal challenges and other sort of possible future challenges if something goes wrong. And the second question is much, much simpler. Somewhere within all these reports, it might be covered, but I haven't had time, I'm sorry. Nearly 2,000 pages. I received them 3 days ago. I admit, hands up, I haven't had the chance to analyze them, to check them, to consult with others to find out. Within that, is the new HGV structure, all these related things, the new companies, etc., are they coming under the ambit of the Freedom of Information Act, or are they exempt from that?
Thank you very much. Councillor Weston, I'm going to to get you to come back on Northumberland Park School. I'm then going to turn to Councillor Strickland, and then I suspect that we'll need answers from a few places. But Councillor Weston.
Thank you, Councillor Brabazon. So the page you were on was 891, and it was what we referred to, what Councillor Rice referred to before, which was 3.4.2.1.2. So it's most of page 891. In terms of the location of the school, I would just reiterate what I said in response to Councillor Rice's question. It is an indicative master plan, and no decisions have been taken on the location of the school yet. Because, as I've said, it's an indicative master plan, and any master plan like this, which was subject to change, as we've said, and this is clear, I think, from the papers, would have to necessarily go back to Cabinet for approval, subject to material changes. I can assure you that those concerns around outdoor spaces are things that I've raised with officers as well, and we have asked them to look again, because nobody would want to re-provide a school which wasn't able to provide for the needs of its children and young people. Alan?
Thank you very much. Right. Various questions here. So starting with Councillor Brabazon's questions. In terms of drawing a red line and it being about disinvestment, it's quite clear that these red lines are about active investment and spending money building new homes. As I mentioned earlier, in terms of what's been communicated to residents, people living within that red line were in the Tottenham AAP area. There was significant consultation about that. And in addition, obviously, as you know, there have been specific consultations run by the regeneration team. In terms of the housing questions you asked, and support and compensation, things like that, and that's exactly what was covered and consulted on in the estate renewal and rehousing policy. That was adopted a few years ago. A new one's being consulted on now. So residents have been consulted on regeneration in Northumberland Park, development, and the compensation package, and whether they think that is appropriate. But it's important to say that because there isn't at the moment a detailed master plan for Northumberland Park, there are still further rounds of consultation to go in that area, which will happen. Secondly, in terms of the Future of Housing Review, it's not the case that the PwC report was commissioned for the Future of Housing Review and it was not considered by the Future of Housing Review, because we were commissioning our own fresh evidence. We commissioned surveying work and condition studies. We also travelled around the country and met many people using these different models, and it was on the basis of all of that evidence that we made our recommendations. In terms of right to return, I think we've already picked up the points in terms of a single move. The key, you're asking about, well, which policy trumps which, because the policy you quoted only talks about Category 1. That's because, as the monitoring officer said earlier, the decisions tonight are fundamentally on Category 1 sites. That's why the policy deals with Category 1.
Councillor Brabazon, Councillor Brabazon, I'm in the chair and I'm asking Councillor Strickland to respond. Sorry, Councillor Brabazon, I'll say it once more. Councillor Brabazon, your questions are being answered. She asked many questions and they're being answered. Councillor Strickland.
Thank you. And then the school questions have been picked up. So going on to Councillor Ibrahim's questions on exclusivity. So this is something we talked about at length in the previous scrutiny call-in, but just to repeat the arguments here. So you've raised a concern a number of times during this process about Lend-Lease starting to make money from day one. And now that would be because Lend-Lease are building homes from day one and are doing work from day one in a way that the council is not. The council is not out there incurring huge cost doing development. As I mentioned earlier, in terms of what are the benefits to the council, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to partnership with a developer because we want them to develop things. So there's a very significant benefit to that partnership. The second thing to say on that is that, of course, having gone through this very lengthy, very stringent and robust procurement process, that then gives us access to a significant developer with a big construction arm, and that gives us much more flexibility as a council to be able to get stuff built, to get stuff done without going through procurement after procurement after procurement, because what we felt is that we did not want to go through a 2-year process like this for every single individual site. In terms of consultation, what would happen if... Sorry?
No, Councillor Ibrahim. Councillor Ibrahim, can I ask you, everyone has listened to people's questions. Please don't interrupt Cabinet members.
Yeah. And as I said, just to repeat my earlier answer, so I was asked that question earlier, the answer I gave was that there's an independent verification team whose job it is to provide external advice on whether or not the contracts Lend-Lease are proposing under the exclusivity agreement are in fact value for money, subject to the duties we discussed. Now, on consultation, you're quite right to say, Councillor Ibrahim, that, as I said to Councillor Tucker earlier, all of these decisions are subject to. These are going to be lengthy decision-making processes. So land being transferred is subject to a Section 105 consultation, it is subject to Cabinet agreement, it is subject to planning. If in the Section 105 agreement, residents are overwhelmingly opposed, and we feel actually there are very significant problems being raised, which we agree with, this is very difficult, there'd be no obligation on the Council, therefore, to transfer that piece of land. You asked about penalties. I think that was answered in answer to Councillor Stennett's question earlier. On the jobs numbers, as I mentioned earlier, the growth strategy, what the HGV will be delivering on jobs has to be in line with the growth and economic development strategy. That sets out quite clearly the mix of jobs that we're looking for, the types of the priority industries that we're looking to encourage to further cluster in the borough, and the 23,000 figure, based on what's in the growth strategy, based on the sites that we're talking about, is a sort of best estimate of what we think could be achieved. On the 5,000 versus 6,400 numbers of homes, 6,400 is the gross number of homes, 5,000 is the net number of homes once you take into account homes that are being rebuilt. And then, Councillor Diakides, I think both of your questions on fiduciary duty and FOI were for the monitoring officer.
Councillor Ibrahim, he just said the gross 6,400, net 5,000. 1,400 homes which are already there and being re-provided. Bernie. Sorry, Councillor Ibrahim, I'm going to turn to the monitoring officer.
I asked a question on vertical and horizontal.
Okay, we'll pick that up. Hang on one moment. Bernie, and then Dan, will you pick up? Sorry, Julian will pick up.
Yes, the vertical build is the infrastructure that rises from the ground. The horizontal build is the foundations, drainage, conduits for electrical and internet. So they get vertical 60%, and then if they are doing vertical, they will also get the horizontal works associated with that.
In terms of the dereliction of fiduciary duty, Councillor Diakides, no, I don't think there's any danger in respect to that. You're not decision makers. In terms of the FOI position, it's...
Bernie, can you continue, please? Sorry, you've asked a question. Can we ask the officer to respond, please?
So, as I said, I don't see that backbenchers can be accused of a dereliction of duty. In terms of the FOI position, it's a nuanced position, but in essence, if the vehicle holds information on behalf of the council, then on occasions that can be subject to FOI, but it's not purely subject to FOI.
Okay, thank you everyone for your contributions. We will thank you, Mr. Diakides, Councillor Diakides, for your contribution. We will return to the recommendations in the private part of the meeting. We move on now. I'm going to deal with item 11 very briefly, and then we will move on to the exempt part of the agenda. Councillor De Mercy.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, this is following the review on July 2015. One of the recommendations was to have a community asset transfer policy, and this report is to deal with that policy, and I put the recommendations to Cabinet for approval.
Thank you, Councillor Enger. Do you still have a question? Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. I just got one question. On page 171 of the main pack, 5.6, you state that if buildings transfer to local community groups, they should be for D1 use only. I wondered if this might be slightly too restrictive, given that these many groups subsidise their good works with on-site cafes and the like. Would you consider amending this slightly to say primarily or majority D1 use?
I don't think there would be any intention to prevent groups from continuing to use the building in that way. The purposes of that D1 restriction is to safeguard the overall use of the building for D1 purposes, i.e. to prevent them being used for primarily commercial uses or, for example, to being sold for housing stock. So I don't see there would be any issue with that continued cafe-type use alongside the community use.
Okay, I just wondered if it could be made slightly clear that that could be considered somewhere, so that
I'm sure we can take that on board. I don't think that's a problem. Cabinet, can I ask you to turn to page 170? The recommendations are set out there. Can I ask if those recommendations are agreed? Thank you. We're very briefly now going to turn to the adjustment to the PAN of the Borough's community secondary schools. Councillor Weston.
Thank you, Leader. As the report makes clear, this report proposes no adjustments to the PANs for the community secondary school following consultation which took place in the second half of last year, and that consultation is detailed at paragraphs 6.4 to 6.8 of the report. It does mean that we may reconsider this in light of any further changes, particularly around clarification from the government on its proposals or not for a national funding formula, but given that it proposes no changes, I hope we can agree the recommendations in the report.
Okay, all very straightforward with no changes proposed. Any questions at all? I don't see them. So page 208 is where the recommendations are set out. Can I ask if those recommendations are agreed, Cabinet? Okay, finally we turn to the minutes of other bodies. Can we note the minutes of the Cabinet members signing on the 20th of June and the leaders signing on the 20th of June? Are they noted? Great. We do not have any new items of urgent business. So at this point, turning to item 15, we now move to the exclusion of the press and public. The press and public are excluded for the remainder of the meeting as item 16 contains exempt information as defined under paragraph 3 and 5, part 1, schedule 12A of the Local Government Act 1972, namely information relating to the financial or business affairs of any particular person, including the authority holding that information, and information in respect of which a claim to legal professional privilege could be maintained in legal proceedings.